recently came across a collection of old letters at an estate sale in Edinburgh, Scotland. They were tucked away in a weathered trunk marked simply with the name C.E. Brady. At first glance, I thought that they might be just routine correspondence from a different era, but as I began to read, I realized these letters told a very haunting story, and I thought the Let's Read audience might appreciate this chilling tale captured in these letters. I've transcribed them here exactly as I found them, and leaving it up to you to decide if they are simply the remnants of history, or maybe something more sinister. As I said, what follows is a series of letters, exchanged between several authors during the spring and summer of 1891. They provide us with an insight into the life and times of one Charles E. Brady, a world-renowned big game hunter from Scotland, as well as those of his assistant, Jack Thompson. And they read as follows. Government House, Livingston, North Rhodesia, the 20th of April, 1891. Sir, in service of Her Majesty Queen Victoria, it is with great respect for your extraordinary reputation that I take up my pen to write to you. Your feats in the wild places of Africa are the stuff of fable, and your name is spoken with admiration in the halls of both London and the colonies. It is therefore to you that I must turn in a matter of utmost urgency and peril. Reports have reached me of grave disturbances in the Luangwa Valley. A beast of no ordinary description has wrought havoc upon the local settlements, destroying crops, maiming livestock, and, lamentably, causing injury and loss of life among the native population. Those who have survived its wrath describe it as a lion of monstrous size and ferocity, though some accounts veer in the realm of the fantastic, suggesting a creature beyond the natural order. Such an affliction upon the people not only jeopardizes their lives and livelihoods, but also imperils the fragile stability of the region. I need not tell a man of your experience that fear and discontent left unchecked can fester into larger troubles. Given your unparalleled expertise in tracking and dispatching the great predators of the African wilderness, I implore you to lend your skill to this urgent endeavor. Your task, should you accept, will not be without danger, but I trust that your courage is equal to the challenge. I shall see to it that you're provided with the capable retinue, adequate supplies, and whatever provisions you might require for the journey. I am fully prepared to compensate you handsomely for your efforts, but I hope that the opportunity to once more test your mettle against nature's fiercest adversaries while rendering a noble service to the crown might also weigh in your decision. I await your reply with great anticipation and remain, sir, yours in earnest faith, Sir Arthur Ashbury, Governor of Northern Rhodesia. Camp on the Luang River, Northern Rhodesia, the 3rd of August, 1891. My dearest Margaret, I hope this letter finds you well, my love, and that our little ones are behaving themselves as I would expect. By now you'll have received my last note sent from the ship, but I am writing to you now from deep in the heart of Africa, where the work I've been called to undertake has finally been laid bare. Margaret, it is no simple task that keeps me from your arms, but one of great peril, and if I succeed, one of great reward. I have come here to hunt a lion, but not just any lion. The beast is a terror, Margaret, a man-eater, prowling the Luangwa Valley and laying waste to everything in its path. It's already taken the lives of several poor souls and left the villages in fear. It's no ordinary creature, I can tell you that much. The natives speak of it in whispers like it's a devil from the bush. And I won't lie to you, Margaret, it's dangerous work. This lion is clever and fierce, and the land here is nothing like I've ever seen before, wild and untamed. The nights are alive with the cries of beasts, and the air is thick with the scent of earth and fire. But Mr. Brady and I have been given a team of trackers who know the terrain, and I've got my rifle in good working order. If I'm careful and keep my wits about me, I'll see this through. The rewards, Margaret, are far more than I could ever hope for back home. The governor himself has promised a handsome sum for my service, enough to see us a good many winters and set the children on a fine path. This could be the opportunity we prayed for, Margaret, the one that lifts us from the scrape of life and into something better. I promise you this, I will return. 4 or 5 months at the most, and I'll be back to you in the Weans. Until then, I ask you to keep me in your prayers and know that every step I take, I carry your love with me. You're the strongest woman I know, Margaret, and it's your face that keeps me steady when the shadows grow long. Kiss the little ones for me and tell them their father will soon be home with the tales of Africa and a heart full of love for them all. Yours now and always, Jack. Camp on the Luangwa River, Northern Rhodesia, 5th of August, 1891. To His Excellency Sir Arthur Ashbury, Governor of Northern Rhodesia, Livingston. Your Excellency, I write to you with a heavy heart and grave tidings from the field. Upon receiving your summons and undertaking this expedition, I arrived with high hopes of quickly addressing the threat posed by the man-eating lion terrorizing the Luangwa Valley. However, what I found at the appointed village of the Luangwa River was a scene of utter desolation. The village was silent, its only occupants the dead. The beast you spoke of had struck before my arrival, leaving a trail of destruction and grief. Several bodies lay scattered, showing unmistakable signs of a lion's ferocious attack. Among them, I regret to inform you, was the man you appointed as my contact, a fine fellow, I am sure, who tragically fell victim to the creature's savagery. The surviving villagers, in their terror, have fled to seek safety further afield, leaving the settlement abandoned. This turn of events leaves me at a crossroads. With no fresh intelligence on the lion's whereabouts, I find myself compelled to return to my camp downriver and await further reports of its movements. It is my hope that the beast's next appearance will be met with swift action, but it troubles me deeply that its rampage may cause further suffering before I am able to bring it down. The lion's cunning is unlike any predator I've encountered in all my years of hunting. It is methodical, striking where it senses weakness and retreating before it can be caught. The terrain of this valley, though breathtaking in its beauty, provides ample cover for such a creature to stalk unseen. I will need every ounce of patience and skill to track it to its lair and end its reign of terror. I shall remain vigilant, Your Excellency, and send word as soon as new developments arise. It is my solemn vow that I will not leave this valley until the lion has been dealt with and the peace of its people restored. I only pray that the cost of lives and livelihood may be kept to a minimum during the time it takes to finish this grim task. I shall send updates as regularly as possible, though the isolation of this region makes communication difficult. Rest assured, I am dedicated to this endeavor and will see it through to the very end. Yours in service to the Crown, Charles E. Brady, big game hunter and explorer. Camp at Luangwa Fork, Northern Rhodesia, 14th August, 1891. My dearest Margaret, I pray this letter reaches you safely, though I fear its contents may cause you distress. I write with a heavy heart, for this expedition has taken a dire turn. What we thought was a single dreadful foe has proven to be far worse, and the task before us is now greater than I could have ever imagined. We've been tracking this lion southward along the river, following its bloody trail when word reached us of fresh attacks in the northern villages. At first, we dismissed it as an error, a case of frightened minds spreading false alarms. But the reports persisted, and when we examined the patterns, a horrifying truth emerged. There is not one man-eater, but two. The realization chilled me to the very bones. These lions are no ordinary beasts, Margaret. They work in tandem, like a force of darkness bent on tormenting this land. As one strikes in the south, the other moves north, leaving destruction and death in their wake. The people here speak of them as demons in lion form sent to punish the living. I am no superstitious man, but looking into the devastation they have wrought, I can see how such fears take hold. We are left with no choice but to divide our strength. Mr. Brady will remain in the south while I make my way northward to defend the villages there. It is a grave risk, splitting our forces this way, but it's the only chance we have to shield the people from further loss. I trust that God will guide my hand and give me the strength to stand against this evil. The situation is desperate, Margaret. I won't lie to you. These lions are cunning and relentless, and the fear they sow weakens the resolve of even the strongest among us. But I cling to the belief that good men, Christian men, will prevail. We fight not for glory, but for the lives of the innocent, and I know in my heart that such a cause cannot be in vain. Please, my love, keep me in your prayers, and as I keep you and the children in mine. I hold your image close to my heart, and it gives me courage when the nights grow dark and the shadows press close. And I promise you, Margaret, I will return to you no matter the trials that lie ahead. Tell the little ones their father loves them dearly and that he fights for them, for their future and for the good of all. I will write again as soon as I am able. Yours, with all my heart, Jack. Camp at Mwamba Crossing, Northern Rhodesia, 1st of September 1891. To Mrs. Margaret Thompson, Yorkshire, England. Dear Madam, it is with profound sorrow and the heaviest of hearts that I write you today. I regret that my words must carry such grief to your home, but it is my solemn duty to inform you of the passing of your husband, Jack, who fell in the line of duty during our efforts to protect the villages of the Luangwa Valley from the scourge of the man-eating lions. Jack gave his life valiantly in the defense of others. His courage and selflessness saved not only the village he fought to protect, but also countless lives that would have otherwise been lost to the terror that has plagued this region. He stood his ground against overwhelming odds, and in doing so, he displayed a bravery that will not be forgotten by those who owe him their lives. Please allow me to assure you that his sacrifice was not in vain. Jack's actions turned the tide of our campaign, giving us the means and time to finally end the threat of these terrible creatures. I can also tell you with complete sincerity that Jack saved my life on more than one occasion during this expedition. Without his steady hand, sharp mind, and fearless heart, I would not be writing this letter today. He was a good man, Mrs. Thompson, the very best of men. Arrangements have been made for his body to be repatriated to England at the earliest opportunity. The governor has authorized a generous dispensation to cover all costs associated with his return and funeral, so that he may be laid to rest with the dignity and honor he so richly deserves. Additionally, further support has been arranged to assist you and your family in this most difficult time. Though words may never ease the pain of such loss, I hope you will take some solace in the knowledge that your husband's sacrifice was made in the service of others, in defense of the innocent, and for the greater good. His actions were those of a hero, and his memory will endure not only in your hearts, but also in the hearts of those he saved. Should you wish, I would be honored to share more about his deeds and bravery during these dark days. He spoke often of you and the children, and it was clear that his love for you gave him strength in the face of danger. Please accept my deepest condolences and know that you and your family are in my prayers. Your humble servant, Charles E. Barclay. The story I'm about to tell you is a mixture of my own recollection and the memories of others from this period. This incident happened back when I was a little girl, so I didn't fully understand what was happening with my parents until it was fully explained to me many years later. But I guess it's no good telling you half a story, so I'll just fill in the blanks where possible too. My mom and dad were never meant to be a couple, and those are my mom's words, not mine. I know that might sound like a pretty messed up thing to say to your own daughter, and it always comes with the caveat that I was the silver lining to all those dark clouds, but it's kind of the truth. From what I've been told, my dad was a psychotic habitual drug user, and since my mom was a teenage alcoholic who was incapable of making good decisions for herself, they ended up dating and mom wound up getting pregnant with me. They had a rocky relationship from the start, but after I was born, things got increasingly and then exponentially worse for them. Dad was still using drugs, so to give us some kind of household income, he started selling them too. And that took up pretty much all of his time, so he was away from home a lot, which left my teenage mom all alone to drink, smoke dope, and try to raise a child. She had to learn from hard experience, and she said for a while there, she was so terrified of how I'd grow up that she'd cry herself to sleep at night. But eventually she scaled back the amount that she was drinking, stopped using drugs altogether, and kinda sorta got the hang of being a mom. Cut to the time I'm 7 years old, and instead of some crummy, run-down 2-bedroom apartment my dad is dealing drugs from, We're living in a crummy, rundown 2-bedroom suburban in another part of the city. My dad's working a steady job, but only really as cover for his nightly activities, which by then was brokering drug deals between local sellers and buying from other cities in the tri-state area. He didn't keep anything at the house, but he was still heavily involved in the business, and although he made a ton of money doing it, almost all of it was used to finance his own personal vices. My mom wanted him to quit, but he wouldn't, and they'd fallen completely out of love by that point, so all they'd do was argue or snap at each other on the rare occasion Dad was ever home. Then toward the end of 1983, Mom said that she wanted us to try Thanksgiving dinner, like an actual one, and not just fried chicken takeout from someplace. Well, long story short, Mom messed up the food. Dad started yelling at her because he'd taken time out from his activities to be there with us, and then Mom ended up relapsing hard by guzzling both bottles of wine that she'd bought and kept untouched for Dad. And by the time she started to yell back at my father, slurring and wobbling as she did, I ran up to my room like I usually did to hide until the yelling had stopped. Sometime later, I'm not sure how much time passed, but I decided that I wanted to head downstairs to get some snacks. Dinner had obviously been canceled, and although the anxiety had kept my appetite at bay for a while, it wasn't long before it kicked in with a vengeance. With my stomach growling, I made my way downstairs, and to get to my kitchen, I had to walk through the little TV room. I opened up the door, fairly confident the fighting had subsided because it was all quiet there, but as I did, I started to hear Mom groaning in a weird way while Dad was saying something to her in hushed tones. I kept on pushing the door until I could see them both. Mom was laying on her side on the couch while Dad was kneeling next to her, looking like he was trying to push something into her mouth, like a small piece of food or a pill. But when he pushed it into her mouth, he took a glass of water and made Mom drink from it until she swallowed. She coughed a few times, but Dad made sure that she got it down and then went about pushing another little pill into Mom's mouth. He made her swallow that one with water too, but then he did it over and over again before my stomach finally rumbled again and I was reminded of why I'd walked downstairs in the first place. And then I started walking through the TV room towards the kitchen. Mom and Dad used to do all kinds of weird stuff down there, so by age 7, I was kind of beyond questioning any of it. And most times when I walked through that room, my dad would either yell at me to get out or ignore me when he was too high to care. Only this time, when my dad noticed that I was walking through the room, he acted surprised, scared even, and then started explaining why he'd been giving Mommy pills. I told him all I wanted was to go get a snack because I was hungry, and then after he very uncharacteristically invited me to help myself to snacks and candy, he joined me in the kitchen and grabbed the biggest round-bottom cooking pan he could find, and then he went back into the room with it. As I walked back through with my snack and candy bars, Dad was supporting Mom as she leaned over and puked into the pan. He was rubbing her back and saying all kinds of very odd and nice things, but I remember how he stuck his fingers in her mouth at one point too. I thought it was maybe to get throw up out of her mouth because she didn't seem like she was fully awake. And now I know different. My dear old dad hadn't been trying to help my mom because she drank too much and made herself sick. He was trying to feed her so many pills that it would kill her. I don't know exactly what his plan was, and my mom doesn't know exactly what combination of pills he tried to give her either, but he certainly didn't plan on me walking in while it was happening. I guess he just tried to keep me calm and unquestioning at first. But when he realized that I might say something to the cops if I ever got questioned, he knew that he had to purge Mom's stomach of the pills before they took effect. And so that's what he did. Mom said she only realized what was happening because in the days after, it felt like she'd been swallowing broken glass. She went to take some pain meds for her very sore throat and then realized a bunch of medication bottles were missing. Dad played dumb and said that he didn't know what she was talking about, but he'd also failed to properly clean the carpet of Mom's vomit. She said that she kneeled down to sniff a patch of carpet just to make sure it wasn't her nose playing tricks on her, and that's when she saw a little white pill sitting under the couch. She'd obviously coughed or spat it out while Dad was force-feeding them to her. Then, in the rush to void her stomach, someone had knocked it under the couch. She was then able to figure out which kind of medication it was and then confronted my dad on where the rest of it had disappeared to. He then gave her some big sob story about how she'd done it to herself and that he'd been the one to save her. But Mom had long since figured out when Dad was lying to her and when he was telling the truth. She left not long after, with me in tow, which I guess is what Dad wanted, to get rid of us, but it was obviously reaching dangerously critical levels of wanting that to happen. If he was willing to hurt Mom, what would he have done with me? Would he have left me on the doorstep of an orphanage with a sign around my neck? Or would I have been the next one to have myself a little accident? Back in November of 2011, my girlfriend, Holly, invited me to Thanksgiving at her parents' place. We'd been seeing each other since February of that year, so it seemed about the right time to meet her folks. But then when I responded with a very enthusiastic yes, she told me it wouldn't be that kind of visit. It wasn't just going to be us and her parents. She was an only child. A bunch of other family members would be there, including her paternal grandpa and her paternal aunt. Her paternal grandpa was a weird old coot, didn't have a great relationship with her dad, and was always a source of tension during holiday get-togethers. But the reason she was really nervous that year, and the reason why she needed me there as, and these are the words she used, a service animal, was the presence of that paternal aunt, a lady who I'll just simply refer to as Janet. Her dad and grandpa didn't get along, but in the case of Aunt Janet, she and Holly's grandpa hadn't said so much as a word to each other in almost 20 years. To be fair, she hadn't spoken to much of anyone since she left town in her 20s, which was apparently sudden, without explanation, and under dubious circumstances. Starting up around the time Holly's grandma died, she kept in touch with her sisters here and there, but she hadn't been home to visit anyone in almost 2 decades. So to have her suddenly showing up again and showing interest in being around the family, it was a really big deal to Holly's mom and dad. As expected, Holly's grandpa had been dead against the idea of her coming to Thanksgiving dinner, but her dad was insistent. It was the first time Aunt Janet had asked to be around them in nearly 2 decades, so there was no way in hell he was about to turn down this first request, because who knew when they'd get another? Everyone acknowledged it was a potentially volatile situation, but being accustomed to such occurrences at everything from Christmases to 4th of July barbecues, Holly's dad felt the potential rewards were worth the risks. Some of Holly's relatives were optimistic, but it was an optimism she didn't share, and she made it abundantly clear that the event would most likely go horribly wrong, and since that wouldn't be particularly pleasant for me to witness, she said that she wouldn't hold it against me if I turned down the invitation. That was how Holly phrased it. But what I heard was, if you put up with my dumb family, then it'll show that you're really serious about this relationship. And since I was getting pretty serious about our future together, it was like she'd thrown me a curveball I had a really good chance of knocking out of the park. Holly's parents lived in a really nice place over in North Jersey. It was a modern colonial with a regal-looking red brick facade and a welcoming porch supported by grand white columns. The front lawn and flower beds were perfectly maintained, and I'm pretty sure I saw a pool, hot tub, and barbecue pit in the backyard, each covered up for the winter. But it was only when I walked inside that I realized just how fancy the place really was. The entranceway consisted of a grand 2-story foyer with sweeping double staircase, gleaming chandelier, and polished hardwood floors. Holly had already told me that her parents made a lot of money, but their house had to be one of the nicest I've ever laid eyes on, and I say that as an avid watcher of those old MTV crib clips. There was a formal living room and dining room, both with coffered ceilings and oversized windows for this natural light, and then a cozy family room with a stone fireplace and brown leather couches. I could think of way worse places to spend Thanksgiving, even if I was about to witness a familial apocalypse. After being greeted by Holly's parents, we were directed into the family room, and since we'd arrived a little earlier than everyone else, I got to enjoy some one-on-one time with her dad. He seemed like a pretty okay guy, a little stern, but a lot more laid back than I expected him to be. Holly had always made her dad out to be this kind of drill sergeant figure, a man who dedicated himself to building his company and who had very little time for anyone else. Holly had always made her dad out to be this kind of drill sergeant figure, a man who dedicated himself to building his company and who had very little time for anyone else. However, once he seemed happy that I wasn't a total douchebag intent on breaking his daughter's heart, he warmed up to me considerably. Holly and her mom brought through some hot apple cider, and we talked a little more before the rest of her relatives began to arrive. A few cousins showed up with aunts and uncles, and then one of her mom's old college friends showed up with her husband. Her grandpa was one of the last people to show up, and when he did, you felt the atmosphere immediately shift from joyful to mildly tense. Holly's grandpa seemed like a real grouchy guy, and I saw two of her aunts go into full-on people-pleasing mode in an attempt to manage the tension and avoid conflict. Grandpa seemed happy to see his daughters, but it was a lukewarm kind of happy. Holly's dad got a stern handshake and a very joyless, good to see you, son. But upon first glance, it didn't seem like he and Grandpa would be at each other's throats. I pointed this out to Holly and then mentioned how maybe that year might buck the trend in terms of family conflict. And she responded with a shake of her head and assured me that what I was seeing was most likely the calm before the storm. In her experience, the tension would inevitably ramp up throughout the course of the afternoon, and then add the return of the prodigal aunt into the mix, and she had a gut feeling that she'd be needing my support by early evening. And like I said, Holly's grandpa seemed stern, like father, like son, but unlike her dad, he didn't seem remotely interested in breaking the ice. When I was introduced as his granddaughter's boyfriend, he seemed completely disinterested and asked Holly's mom why I was there if I wasn't family. Then, when she tried to explain, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand. It was obnoxious in the extreme, but I'd been warned of how much of an a-hole he could be, so it's not like I felt wounded when he treated me so rudely. Actually, it was kind of a relief. I didn't give a crap about what her weird old grandpa had to say. If my potential future mother and father-in-law were chilled, then that was all I cared about. Holly's grandpa could go off, and sure, it'd be pretty unpleasant in the moment, but if things got a little too crazy, I'd be there to drive her home and make sure that she got the support that she needed. And after that, I was quite sure that the whole thing would be forgotten about in like a week, or maybe a month, or however long it took, and it'd be like it had never even happened in the first place. But when the incident did come, it wasn't some run-of-the-mill family yelling match. It was bigger, more frantic, and more frightening than anything I could have ever imagined. And so once I had the meeting with Holly's grouchy grandpa out of the way, I was feeling pretty good about the rest of the afternoon. He'd been making comments about me all day, about how I shouldn't have been there, about how they shouldn't be letting me date Holly, but literally everyone seemed chill except him, so it just became a case of staying out of his way and ignoring his jabs, and everything would go relatively smoothly. The only other real test the get-together had to endure was the arrival of Holly's Aunt Janet. Less than an hour before we all sat down for dinner, Aunt Janet arrived at Holly's parents' place. She was the oldest of her siblings, but looked pretty good for her age and showed up carrying what looked like some kind of portfolio bag, the kind artists use to transport their paintings from place to place. Aunt Janet and her siblings had talked while she was away, so it wasn't like it was their first time talking to her in 20 years, but it was still a profoundly emotional affair. There was a lot of hugging, a few tears, and Aunt Janet was even swapping greetings with her long-estranged father without incident. So even that late in the day, I was convinced that I dodged a major bullet and that everything might turn out all right. Janet and her sisters were sort of entrenched in catching up for about an hour while Holly's grandpa and some of the other guys watched football in pretty much next to silence, until finally, Holly's mom called us all to dinner. Holly was Italian on her mom's side, so in addition to most of the usual Thanksgiving stuff, there were things like shrimp cocktails, baked clams, and even a charcuterie board. Then instead of mashed potatoes or candied yams, Her mom served baked ziti with her butter-basted turkey along with roasted Brussels sprouts and string beans sautéed in garlic and olive oil. And everything she put down on the table was absolutely incredible, and primarily most of the reason I remember most of it. And so much so that once everything was dolled out, the whole table quit talking for a solid 10 minutes and we just stuffed our faces until conversation slowly started up again. Everyone was focused on how good the food was, at least until after dinner when topics started to meander and Holly's father and aunt started to reminisce about their childhood. Aunt Janet stayed quiet for the most part, and then while Holly's mom started to clear the table after dessert had been served, Janet volunteered to help her. We talked amongst ourselves for a while, then once people started to try and get up from the table and do their own thing, Janet reappeared with that portfolio bag in her hand. She politely asked everyone to take a seat again because she wanted to host an after-dinner parlor game for us as a thank you for being such gracious hosts. Everyone seemed pretty excited. Then once we'd all returned to our seats, Janet announced that she'd liked everyone at the table to partake in a game of word association. She'd been gone for such a long time and by her own admission hadn't kept up to date with everyone nearly as much as she should have. So what better way to start the process of catching up than with a friendly, non-competitive game of word association. When Aunt Janet said parlor game, I figured that she just meant like charades or something. But when it came to word association, I didn't understand where the challenge actually was, and apparently neither did Holly's grandpa. He started up by asking something like, "The goddamn point of all of this?" but was quickly silenced by Holly's dad, who told him to be polite and allowed Janet to host the game that she had planned. Everyone went quiet, and then Janet grabbed the large portfolio bag and revealed it to contain a portable whiteboard complete with legs to stand on. Now, these sort of expectant looks were exchanged on account of how well prepared she was, and at first, people were confused but excited. Then, after pulling out a marker from the whiteboard's carry bag, Aunt Janet began to write. The first word that she wrote on the whiteboard was school. Aunt Janet then went around the room asking for words or phrases people associated with school. My own personal answer was lunch, but she also got answers like teacher, homework, football team, and other things of that nature. Aunt Janet did the same thing with the word boathouse, then the word bear, and then finally she sort of surveyed all of our thought associations with the word truth. By the time she was done, Janet had written 4 big prompt words on the board along with dozens of smaller words leading off from the larger words, kind of like a mind map. She then put the cap back on the pen and then took a step back from the board and asked us all what we saw. Seeing as none of us could tell if her question was rhetorical or not, everyone stayed quiet and waited for the answer. And Janet wasted no time in telling us. She pointed to all the answers we'd given and told us that they were all kinds of answers that regular people give, whereas all her own answers were considerably different. Janet said that when she thought of the word school, she thought of the word sick, and that was due to all the sick days that she'd taken whilst in elementary school. I remember thinking, where's she going with this exactly? But then right after she said that last thing, Janet turned to Holly's grandpa and says, "You remember all those sick days too, don't you, Dad? But I was never really sick, was I? At least not for the most times you called the school and told them I was too sick to attend." There was this sort of discomfort across the dining table, and Holly's grandpa grumbled something about not knowing what she was talking about. But then Aunt Janet says, "Oh, you don't? You sure about that, Dad? You sure you got no idea what I'm talking about? Well, how's about this next word? Boathouse." Aunt Janet then said that whenever she saw or thought of the word boathouse, she didn't think of fishing trips or lakeside vacations. She thought of the pain she'd suffered one summer when she was a kid. She went on to describe how when Holly's father was just a baby, the family had gone on a vacation in upstate New York. Janet had ended up misbehaving somehow, and Holly's grandpa had dragged her away from the lake and into a friend's boathouse for a stern talking to. But a stern talking to was not all she got. Janet claimed the punishment that she was given was a far cry from anything considered acceptable between father and daughter, and that the pain that she felt afterwards was so fierce that she couldn't sit down without her tummy hurting. Again, Holly's grandpa grumbled something about having no memory of the event, and everyone else stayed very quiet. Aunt Janet then pointed to the word bear, and then to a few of our more innocent associations. We'd said things like grizzly and teddy bear, and while Janet also associated the word with the small, stuffed, and cuddly variety, her further associations were not positive ones. Janet said that she associated teddy bears with distraction, delusion, even disassociation, because it was her teddies that her father told her to cuddle whenever he did things no father should ever be doing to their daughter. There was a straight-up gasp when she said that, and no one dared to get up from their chairs, and as Holly's grandpa began to yell about Janet being a crazy C-word, Janet shrieked over him so loud that everyone, including Grandpa, was silenced. That's when she pointed to the word truth, and although I definitely won't quote her verbatim because I'm quite confident it'll get your channel a strike or a warning or something of that nature, this is roughly what she said. Janet said that whenever she thought of the word truth, she felt that she'd been robbed of any positive association. Other people heard or read that word and it gave them hope for a sense of order and justice in the world. When she thought of the word truth, it was like a dagger in her gut. It hurt because for her whole life, she'd wondered if anyone would ever believe the truth of what her own father did to her when she was growing up. And even if she did one day find the courage to talk about it, she wondered how in the world a person goes about announcing something like that. Well, apparently, Janet had plenty of time to think about it. Then when she finally made up her mind and had the perfect method of delivery planned out, she called up Holly's dad and asked if she could attend Thanksgiving that year. And by the time Janet had finally finished her speech, people were either sobbing or just completely filled with shock. Then as she asked Holly's grandpa to say something, anything, he went from completely ashen and silent to filled with rage. He screamed at Janet, but Janet screamed right back at him. Holly's aunts were crying while her dad looked like he was on the verge of a mental breakdown. All of the people that weren't immediate family excused themselves and headed for the door the minute things started flying off the handle. I just remember reaching for Holly's hand and holding it. She looked like she was on the verge of catatonia, pale and wide-eyed, like her mind was struggling to compute what she had just heard. And I kept telling her, "We can leave if you want to," but she wouldn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on Janet and her grandpa, who suddenly rose from her chair and walked off toward the kitchen. Janet yelled something to him, and then when she appeared to run out of steam, she turned and walked towards her whiteboard and began packing it into its case, soundtracked by the sobbing of her sisters. It was probably one of the more surreal experiences of my entire life. Seeing the breakdown of a family like that would be emotionally intense at the very best of times, but to have such a sickening 30-year-old secret divulged like that was the kind of drama I've only ever seen in movies or TV. In those situations, people are glued to what they're seeing on screen. But then in real life, it's like I wanted the ground to just open up and swallow me so I didn't have to bear witness to any more mind-shattering heartbreak. I really did want nothing more than to get out of there, but there was no leaving without Holly. Wherever she went, I went, and for better or for worse. At first, it didn't look like Holly's grandpa was going to re-enter the dining room, and I don't think anyone had wanted him there either. I got the impression that with Holly's dad and aunts, the abuse of their elder sister and at the hands of their father was something they'd long suspected but never had confirmed. The shock only lasted a minute or two. What came next was this very deep, resounding grief, like they'd always known and had just never wanted to accept it. And after all, Holly's grandpa had barely said a word in his own defense, but then seconds later, he reappeared in the dining room's doorway with one hand held firmly behind his back. From where I was sitting, I couldn't see what Grandpa was concealing, but as he walked across the room and approached Aunt Janet, Holly's dad caught a glimpse of what he was holding and jumped from his chair. He yelled, "Dad, no!" and then threw himself across the room at him, just as Holly's grandpa raised a kitchen knife above his head. I don't think he'd have actually been able to stab Aunt Janet because she saw it coming way early and jumped back as Holly's dad grabbed Grandpa's arm. Grandpa was a man possessed. Like you could see it in his eyes that he'd completely lost his mind, but he was old and slow. While Holly's dad was still relatively fast but much, much stronger. And within seconds, Holly's dad had Grandpa restrained and Aunt Janet was walking out of the house while yelling assurances that no one would ever see her again. Not long after Janet left, and with Grandpa being sort of sequestered in another room, Holly decided it was finally time to leave. She stayed quiet the whole drive home, stayed in bed for almost a week afterwards, and ignored phone calls from just about everyone except me and a handful of her friends. She didn't want to talk about what had happened. In fact, we broke up long before I ever got the chance to really discuss things with her, or rather before there came a time when she was comfortable talking about it. And I don't blame her either. If that was me, I wouldn't even want to believe it, let alone be able to summon the strength to talk about it. And so despite seeing her family's breakdown up close, I never found out what happened in either the immediate or long-term aftermath. I still think about Holly quite often, even all these years later. I wonder how she's doing, and if her family ever found peace. I've sometimes thought about reaching out to her just to see how she's doing, but something tells me I'll only be a painful reminder of the single worst day of her life. Hi, let's read. This story was shared with me by my late grandfather, who has long since passed away. He used to tell it to us as kids, sitting by the fire on cold, quiet nights. At the time, we thought it was just one of his wild tales meant to entertain us. After his passing, I found his journal among his things, and there it was, written down by his own hand. Now, reading it gave me chills all over again, as I always thought these were just fantasies in his head. But now I'm sharing it with you exactly as told to me because I think it deserves to be remembered. So thank you for sharing if you do. Long ago, back in the summer of 1925, I applied for a job as a game warden on a large country estate. I'd grown up in rural England, and as a boy I'd spent countless hours walking the local woods and fields and learning the habits of game birds, deer, and other wildlife. I had and still have a huge passion for the great British countryside, and so with that in hand, I approached the estate manager of the nearby Capsthorne Hall. I handed Mr. Wilkinshaw a letter of recommendation from the local rector, a man who'd known me since I was a boy. Back in those days, character counted just as much as ability, but the letter didn't appear to sway Mr. Wilkinshaw in the least bit. He told me that being a game warden was no job for a young man such as myself, and that even if I was bullheaded enough to disagree, Capsthorne Hall wasn't the place for me to start. I tried to plead my case, but Mr. Walkinshaw was steadfast in his dismissal, at least until I'd turned my back on him and walked away a few steps. It was then that he called after me and told me if I was serious about working with him, I should return the next morning and after rethinking my proposal. Well, I thought about it and decided that I still fancied life as a game warden, and so back I went the next morning to talk to Mr. Walkinshaw. Impressed at my return, Mr. Walkinshaw invited me to partake in an on-the-stop interview, which thankfully was far from formal. He took me on a walk across the grounds, quizzing me on my knowledge of wildlife and how I'd handle trespassers or poachers. I had to demonstrate that I could recognize the tracks of different game animals and predict their movements. Then, as for the areas of knowledge I was lacking in, Mr. Walkinshaw assured me that he'd fill in the gaps. I'd receive ample instruction on the handling, maintenance, and use of firearms. I'd also be taught how to track a poacher's path, how to mend a broken pheasant pen, and how to set snares or traps with precision. However, once I had proven my competence, Mr. Walkinshaw informed me that perhaps the most important factor wasn't my proficiency, it was how much I could be trusted. The landowners often entertained guests for hunts, and it was vital to ensure their enjoyment without any disruption or violation of their privacy. I assured them that I could do the job quietly and efficiently, and that the lord of the manor's private business was of no interest to me whatsoever. Then, and only then, was I offered the position, which came with accommodation in the form of a small cottage on the edge of the estate. My duties began immediately, checking the pheasant pens, repairing fences, setting traps for foxes, and patrolling the grounds after dark. It was solitary work, but I got a great deal of satisfaction from it, ensuring the game thrived and that the estate remained secure. It became a matter of personal pride for me. But at the same time, the job wasn't without its challenges. Poachers were a constant threat, and dealing with them required firmness and tact. But in those early days, I relished the responsibility and the rhythm of life in service to the land. But reality was, I labored in ignorance of Mr. Walkinshaw's rather cryptic warning, as well as the estate's true nature. It was a clear, quiet night in the late autumn, the kind where the air is still balmy, but the faint rustle of leaves can carry for miles. I was doing my usual rounds, patrolling the far edges of the estate near the woods that bordered the nearby moors. The pheasants had been restless that week, and I suspected a fox had been prowling close to their pens. So, with my lantern casting a soft golden glow ahead of me and my shotgun rested comfortably in the crook of my arm, I carefully and silently patrolled while keeping my ears and eyes peeled. As I approached the old oak tree near the gamekeeper's path, I heard an unnatural sound coming through the trees. It wasn't the stealthy padding of a fox or the quick dart of a hare, but rather a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It came from the deeper part of the woods, beyond where my lantern could reach, and the moment I heard it, I paused, my grip tightening on the shotgun. And then I saw it, just beyond the trees where the shadows grew thick. At first it looked like a man crouched low on the ground, but there was something about the way it moved, something that seemed wrong to me. Its shoulders were hunched and too broad, while its limbs seemed far too long to be those of a fox or even a deer. The moonlight caught its eyes, reflecting a yellow gleam that sent a shiver through me. It sniffed the air, and I could see the glint of sharp teeth and a mouth that seemed too large for any human face. My instinct told me to retreat, but my duty held me fast. Poachers I could deal with, predators too. But this was something else entirely. I raised my shotgun, calling out, "Who's there?" with my voice sounding steadier than I felt. The figure straightened, and that's when I saw its full height, taller than any man, with a body covered in coarse, dark fur. Its hands, or claws, whatever they were, hung at its side, long and sharp, and as my eyes found them, I began to question the strength of my shotgun. It stepped forward, slowly and deliberately, and I fell rooted to the spot. Was it a man in some terrible costume, an animal disfigured by disease? I asked 1,000 questions in just a few short seconds, but no answer satisfied my terror. Its growl deepened, reverberating in my chest like thunder. I raised the shotgun, then fired a warning shot into the air. The sound echoed through the woods, startling a flock of roosting birds into flight, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a bone-chilling howl that started low but rose into a piercing wail. My heart pounded. I took a step back, and then another, and another. Thankfully, the creature advanced no further and instead stood its ground, watching me with eyes that glowed in the bright silvery moonlight. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned, dropped back down to all fours, and then melted into the shadows of the trees. I stood there for what felt like hours, my breathing ragged and my shotgun trembling in my hands. Then when I finally found the courage to move, I walked briskly back to the estate, lantern swinging wildly at my side. The usual sounds of the woods unnervingly absent. The night felt heavier. I was not alone. The next morning I approached Mr. Walkinshaw and informed him of my nocturnal encounter. I had assumed his reaction would be incredulous, that he'd accuse me of drinking on the job or having far too fanciful an imagination. Yet he seemed so unsurprised by my report that I began to feel very unsettled. He told me that he too had experienced nocturnal encounters with such a beast, but that it was no threat to him or anyone else working at the estate. He said that, in a manner of speaking, the creature was Lord Capesthorne's pet, and that its ilk had called the estate home for centuries. Any encounter with one of the beasts was sure to put the fear of God into a man, yet he assured me that slaying it would bring untold woe to the estate and its holders. Trusting in his experience and expertise, I took Mr. Walkinshaw's word to heart. But every time I patrolled that part of the estate after dark, I carried a heavier lantern and extra shells, and a prayer whispered under my breath. Whatever that thing was, beast, man, or nightmare, it reminded me that some corners of the wild still belong to the unknown. A few years back, I drove over to my parents' place to spend Thanksgiving with them and our extended family. As I stepped out of my car, I remember smelling the smoke of burning log fires drifting on the breeze, and it was like stepping through a time machine. I don't know about you, but there's something really special about that time of year when all the different smells and sensations of late fall can take you right back to being a kid again. But I wasn't a kid anymore, far from it in fact. I had taken my place as the unmarried uncle, showing up halfway through the day after spending the morning at work. The driveway of my parents' house was lined with cars, and as I walked towards the front door, I could already hear the swirls of conversation and laughter coming from inside. After knocking on the door, my mom appeared on the entrance, and as she welcomed me inside, a wave of warmth and rich aromas hit my face. The combined scent of roast turkey and spiced pies and something unmistakably buttery hung thick in the air. And then as Mom pulled me in for a big hug, I truly felt at home. After we swapped a little small talk regarding the weather and the drive over, Mom walked me into a living room alive with activity and then announced my arrival. My cousins were sprawled across the couches, looking away from their football game for just the briefest of moments to greet me with raised beer bottles. A few of the kids were sitting on the floor between them, holding plates of snacks and chattering amongst themselves, and it was amazing to see how much they've grown. In the kitchen, a few of my aunts and uncles sat around the dinner table sipping glasses of wine. Even more children darted in and out as my mom made her way to the stove, joined by an aunt who started stirring and tasting and then passing notes back to Mom. It was loud, messy, and in my mind, perfect. It felt like Thanksgiving and it felt like home. I asked my mom if that was everyone, as in everyone who was due to show up for dinner, and she said that we were only waiting on one other person to show up, and that person was Uncle Tony. My Uncle Tony was still considered the baby among his siblings and was only around 10 years older than myself at the time, so early 40s. He was a pretty unremarkable guy, close to my grandpa but quiet and mostly kept to himself. I lived out of town, but Uncle Tony lived out of state, so every family holiday he'd make the 4-hour drive across state lines and was usually the last to join us. Personally, I was always figured that he deliberately timed his journey to coincide with dinner being less than an hour from the table. He was never a particularly outgoing person, so I figured all the small talk and catching up with distant relatives was a bit of a headache for him. He'd show up before dinner, eat his fill, and then relax with us for a few hours while everyone was too full of turkey to say anything to each other. But then that year, it looked like he was cutting things a little too close for comfort. About a half hour before Mom was set to ring the dinner bell, she asked me to text Uncle Tony for his estimated time of arrival, and I figured he'd be driving, so I didn't expect his immediate response, but when dinner was only around 5 minutes from the table, Mom asked me to give him a call to check where he was. I called once, but it went to voicemail. I then called a second time, but it didn't ring as long as before the call went to his answering machine. and I figured that that was a sign of life since him declining the call meant that he was probably only a few blocks away. He also wouldn't want to risk a ticket by, talking on the wheel or something on a day when the cops are pretty much just dying to bag themselves a few drunks or bad drivers to make holiday examples out of. I told all that to my mom, but she was still very concerned, so she had me calling my Uncle Tony on repeat while she got everyone to the table. She then asked me to sort of help deal with dishes and serving plates to everyone at the table, but once we'd all sat down to eat, she kept checking her phone and complaining that Tony wasn't responding to messages. All the adults who knew him checked their phones just in case he sent somebody a message that they hadn't seen yet. But when they didn't see any notifications from him, they just began consuming their food. And no one seemed all that worried about Tony at first, but it wasn't because they didn't care. He was always the last to show up and did so by that small margin that I talked about earlier, so they figured that he'd just run into a little bit of traffic or something and would be there within the hour. And so by the time we'd all finished our bowls of pumpkin pie and hand-whipped vanilla cream and all that good stuff, Uncle Tony still hadn't shown up, and neither had he called or texted to let us know where he was. A few of us started calling and texting him again, only this time with very added concern. It was my phone that his name first flashed across, as it buzzed with an incoming text message notification, but despite what I read being totally innocuous, it was somehow oddly unsettling too. Uncle Tony had texted me, but all his message read was, "Hi." It's hard to articulate what I felt in the moments that followed. Getting that single word message was so out of character that I think I instinctively knew something was wrong with Uncle Tony from the moment I read it. However, as I tried to figure out how to properly convey my concern, I stayed quiet, just long enough to hear the phones of my relatives begin to buzz with their own incoming messages. They came in at a rate of about one every 10 to 15 seconds, but one by one, my aunts, uncles, mother, and father all got single-word messages that simply read, "Hi." It was one of my uncles that got the first message as he read it out loud for everyone to hear. There were a few moments of confusion as people wondered why he might send such a very weird message when he was almost 90 minutes late for dinner. And then right as the concern started to register on their faces, my mom tapped her phone, put it to her ear, and waited for my Uncle Tony to answer her call. When he once again failed to pick up, we all started sending him messages mostly along the lines of "Are you okay? Pick up the phone. Call us when you can." I was the first to receive a reply. "Hope I haven't left you all waiting, lol," it read. It was completely inconsistent with Uncle Tony's usual style of texting, and knowing the person on the other end wouldn't answer any calls, I found myself texting, "Who is this?" The reply came in seconds and simply read, "Thumbelina." Knowing I probably wasn't going to get anything useful out of them, I decided to ask one more question before calling the cops. I texted, "Where's Tony?" Then when the reply came, I had to struggle to keep a straight face as I got up from the table. I told everyone I was going to call a friend of his just in case he passed out drunk and they were texting from his phone as a prank or something. It was a dumb excuse. Everyone knew that wasn't like Uncle Tony to get blackout drunk like that, and had appropriately confused expressions as I got up from the table and walked into the kitchen. But honestly, I couldn't think of anything else to say. All my brain power was focused on maintaining this complete poker face, not freaking the heck out, because in response to my messages of "Where's Tony?", whoever had this phone had texted me back, "I don't know, but there will be no more Thanksgivings where he's going, ha 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 ha." The first thing I did when I walked into the kitchen was call the cops. One of my uncles followed and soon figured out that I wasn't talking to Uncle Tony's friend. We tried to keep the news from spreading, but the rest of the adults soon figured out something was wrong when whoever had Tony's phone started texting them similarly creepy stuff. After that, the mood in the house began to sharply decline, but everyone managed to keep from totally panicking or displaying too much of any other emotion, at least until all the kids were either upstairs or on the way home from their parents. And after that, all bets were off, and my mom and aunt were fanning themselves in between bouts of sobbing, praying this whole thing was just some sick joke. But sadly, it wasn't. By the time I placed the 911 call in my mom's kitchen, the cops had already found my Uncle Tony. He was sitting in his car, which was parked in the parking lot of a closed-up business, and he was leaned up against the steering wheel with a bullet hole through his head. They found his phone just a few hours later, in the hands of a girl sitting in a diner only a few miles from where Tony's car was found. She'd cut off his thumb so she could keep unlocking his phone every time she wanted to use it, and although she could have used it to do just about anything, she chose to taunt the relatives of the man she just shot through the head on the way to a family Thanksgiving. And from what I understand, the whole thing was a pretty open and shut case. The girl was so crazy that when the cops arrived to arrest her, she insisted on finishing off a text message before they put her in cuffs. She didn't get to send it, but she was in the process of typing on a message to one of Tony's coworkers, gloating about how he'd never get to see him again. I think she spent about 5 minutes with psychiatrists before they declared the girl to be completely and utterly out of her mind. She was detained at the hospital and has been there ever since. The cops later said that they figured that she was some type of hitchhiker, and since she was young, small of stature, and generally disarming in appearance, Uncle Tony had most likely offered to give her a ride someplace. But that is something that never, ever sat right with us. Like I said earlier, Tony was a very reserved kind of guy, possibly to the point that you might call him selfish. There's no way he'd have stopped to give anyone a ride, not unless they were in serious life or death kind of trouble. He'd rather forego the human interaction, and Mom said he was like that since pretty much forever. So we've all kind of wondered just what happened for him to pull over and let that girl into his car, because it wouldn't be like any Uncle Tony we knew to put himself at risk like that, not unless something was very, very wrong. From 2009 to 2017, I served as an infantryman in the British Army's Duke of Lancaster's regiment. I applied to join just before my 22nd birthday, and to be honest, I really didn't know what I was getting myself into. But after the initial shock of training, I found it was exactly what I was looking for. I won't bore you with all the cliches about the camaraderie or the spiritual satisfaction that duty brings, because for me, it was the structure I enjoyed the most. I had a terrible time in school, so much so that my mom and dad thought that I had a problem with authority. They thought I was mental for even considering the army and said I'd be thrown out within a week. But when the staff training you have all been to Iraq and Afghanistan 2 or 3 times apiece and actually been in combat, it's a lot easier to pay them the respect they demand. And so, just a few months of training, I went from a dickhead layabout with a reputation for getting myself into trouble to an infantry soldier, fit for service in one of the finest armed forces in the world. I joined a little bit too late to see Iraq, but I ended up going to Afghanistan for 6 months over 2013 to 2014 as part of an Afghan Army mentoring team, or OMLET. Soldiering was my life. I didn't want to do anything else, and I could see myself pushing 50 and retiring as some crusty old sergeant with a big fat pension and plenty of time for golf and the grandkids. But as the saying goes, God laughs at those who make plans. In my 8th year of service, so just after I turned 30 in 2017, there was an accident during a training exercise in Wales and I suffered a pretty severe back injury. I did some rehab for a while and I suspected that I'd be medically discharged, but the notice came and I was devastated. I put so much faith in the rehab process that I hadn't mentally prepared myself for the worst to happen. So once I was out of the army, I just felt lost. I worked 4 different jobs in the year after I got out. I'd work somewhere for a few months, get sick to my back teeth of the job and the people, and then move on to something else, hoping the results might be different. I found the work dull. I had sod-all respect for most of my bosses, and most of my colleagues were a major pain in the arse, but no matter where I went, it'd be the same routine every single time. Get job, get bored, get shut. But then finally, I got a phone call from an old mate who was still in the regiment. He knew that I was having a rough time in the civilian job market, but he also said that he might just have the solution for me, and that solution came in the form of a very unique employment opportunity. The Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, is one of the most war-torn countries on Earth, and since 1950, it's been embroiled in 7 major civil conflicts. The near non-stop violence means that vast swaths of the country are now lawless and are completely at the mercy of rebel militias or criminal gangs. These groups are often indistinguishable from one another, both in appearance and in their method of violence. But they both have something else in common, in that they both found a truly diabolical way of financing their operations: the poaching of rare and endangered African animals. In the early 2010s, the situation in one of the DRC's national parks got so bad that the country basically begged the international community for help. In Virunga National Park, poachers were killing rare birds, reptiles, antelopes, even hippos for their teeth. But the thing that really caused international outcry was when they started targeting the elephants and gorillas. Virunga is one of the few remaining habitats of the critically endangered mountain gorilla, so when conservationists noticed that they were being shot, caught, or killed in poachers' traps, they were devastated. African forest elephants are also critically endangered, so when the poachers started killing them just to hack off their tusks and leg it, global wildlife charities reacted in a similarly furious fashion. And in the end, the European Union decided to set up what's called the Virunga Foundation, which took its entire African conservation budget and poured it into the defense of Virunga National Park. The foundation inflated the park's budget by around 80%, and then essentially took responsibility for both the park's conservation efforts and its overall security. They employed dozens of additional park rangers and supplied them with small arms, and then, after only the most minimal of training, would send them out to deter poachers and evict illegal farmers from the boundaries of the park. However, while the rangers' initial efforts proved effective, it drove the poachers into an ad hoc alliance with a group of armed rebels known as the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, or for short, the FDLR. In late 2015, when a group of rangers and government soldiers attempted to evict one of the last illegal farmers in Virunga, they were ambushed by a team of poachers and FDLR fighters. When the smoke had cleared, 15 soldiers and 1 park ranger laid dead. And in a bid to preserve human life and at the direction of both the Foundation and the Congolese government, the rangers ceded ground to the poachers and rebels. They hoped the move might put an end to the violence in Virunga, but they were wrong. In August of 2017, 5 park rangers were attacked while on a routine patrol near Lake Edward. They were first pinned down by a sniper firing from a distant tree line, and then as they struggled to escape, assault teams descended on them from 2 opposing directions. Ranger HQ sent a reaction force of rangers and Congolese soldiers to relieve them, but one by one, the rangers' radios fell silent, and by the time the reaction force reached their position, all 5 rangers were dead. And the same thing happened just a few months later during the spring of 2018 when 5 more rangers and a Congolese army driver were ambushed and killed. And this brought the total number of murdered rangers to a shocking 175. But, as in so many other similar situations, it didn't become critical until the region's tourism was affected. In May of 2018, 2 young British tourists named Bethan Davies and Robert Jesty were on a tour of Virunga when they were spotted by a group of rebels. The ranger charged with guiding them, a 25-year-old named Rachel Baraka, attempted to defend them, but was killed almost immediately as the rebels attacked their position. After a period of negotiation, along with rumors that an SAS hostage rescue team was en route to Virunga, Bethan and Robert were eventually released. But their kidnapping meant that in June of 2018, Virunga had to be closed until the safety of visitors could be ensured. And this, boys and girls, is how my job opportunity arose. And by the summer of 2018, almost every citizen of Eastern Congo knew exactly how dangerous it was to take a job as a ranger. Reports regarding ranger casualties were being widely and frequently published, and it was common knowledge that taking on the poachers and rebels meant doing so with minimal equipment and manpower. In so many words, Becoming a Virunga Park Ranger was practically a death sentence, so as you can imagine, their recruitment levels dropped off dramatically. At least until they brought in the requirements and extended an invitation to international applicants. If you had any experience as an infantry soldier, the Virunga Foundation was offering very generous pay packets to anyone willing to help train and mentor the ranger teams. As I mentioned earlier, being on that Afghan omelet team meant that I had the exact expertise that they were looking for. It would be dangerous work, and there was every chance that I'd end up getting shot at. But for me, hearing that only sealed the deal. By some bizarre twist of fate, I had a golden opportunity to carry on soldiering, and you can bet your bottom dollar that I grabbed hold of that opportunity with both hands, like a chimp ripping its owner's face off. And just a few weeks after getting that phone call from my mate in the regiment, I was boarding a plane at Manchester Airport, bound for Eastern Congo. 18 hours later, I landed at Goma Airport at around 4 a.m. local time, then met up with my contact in the arrivals lounge. When I was first told about the former Green Beret, whose job it was to orientate international recruits, I pictured some Chuck Norris lookalike who ate bullets, pissed petrol, and crapped rolls of barbed wire. But when I walked into the arrivals lounge, the bloke holding the sign with my name on it looked more like a cross between Jim Morrison and Charles Manson. And I remember thinking, there's no way this guy is ex-special ops. But then, the more we talked, the more I realized that he was every bit as legit as he'd been made out to be. His name was Jason, but everyone called him Top because he retired as a first sergeant. He was also the top guy when it came to international recruits, so I suppose taking his title as a moniker just made things easier for people. He was in his 40s, had shoulder-length graying brown hair that was receding up top, and then a bushy coppery beard that was a silvery gray around his chin. With his bead bracelets, lion claw necklace, and tea-shade glasses, he resembled some kind of New Age safari tourist. But the lingo he used, the way he carried himself, and the fact that he was almost fluent in the local language all made me think, yeah, this bloke's the real deal. From Goma Airport, we traveled by minibus to a much smaller airstrip in the southern section of Virunga National Park. The journey took around 2 hours, giving Top and I plenty of time to get acquainted after he filled me in on what to expect. We'd be flying over Lake Edward before landing at a ranger base camp at a place called Ishango. There, I joined several other foreign volunteers in training and mentoring the rangers. But most importantly, I'd also be going on patrol with them, and going on patrol meant getting into scraps. Top made that abundantly clear to me. If I went on patrol, there wasn't merely a chance that I'd be exchanging fire with poachers or rebels. It was a certainty. And after arriving at the airstrip and taking to the skies in a small single-engine air taxi, I got a lesson in just how enormous Africa really is. For scale, the largest lake in England is Lake Windermere at 5.7 square miles, and comparatively, the largest lake in Scotland is Loch Lomond, which clocks in at a whopping 27 square miles. But then Lake Edward, which separates the northern and southern portions of Virunga National Park, has a jaw-dropping surface area of 897 square miles. At one point, while we were flying over it in what amounted to a rusty tin bucket with a propeller attached, it looked like we were out at sea, flying across the friggin' Atlantic or something. You could only barely see land off to our left, and the invisible shores off to our right were so far away that they weren't even in the Congo anymore. They were in Rwanda. Top and our pilot seemed to find a great deal of amusement at how anxious I was. I'm ex-Army, not ex-RAF, but flying over Lake Edward was smooth sailing compared to our landing at Ishango. It was still early morning when I arrived, but the camp was alive with activity. In one corner, nestled among some trees, were a grouping of small homes occupied by the 24 rangers which were permanently stationed there. The much newer volunteer accommodation was about 100 feet away on the other side of the solar panels which supplied most of our electricity. There was a mess hall, sanitation pits, wash facilities, and an armory, along with medical facilities, a comm center, and even a football pitch the blokes used for recreation. I remember being impressed by what amounted to a pretty decent setup, one that was much better than any of the forward operating bases I'd seen in Afghanistan. But what I was really excited to do was meet some of the lads I'd be working with. The first, and probably the bloke that I spent the most time with, was an Irishman. I'll just call him Paddy. Now, Paddy wasn't his real name, but as an Irish Army reservist, he didn't have the proper permission to take part in a foreign conflict. And that meant, should the Irish Army have found out what he was doing, he could have potentially gotten himself into a fair bit of trouble. He was a great soldier, a good lad, loved the crack, as they say, and he was a huge fan of English football too, so that gave us plenty to talk about right away. Then there was the ginger lad from Texas with the backward name. Everyone called him Tanner, which I assumed was his last name, but then his full name turned out to be Tanner Scott. I asked him if some sort of mistake had been made on his birth certificate, because surely his name should have been Scott Tanner, but surprisingly, he couldn't see the joke. What he could do, on the other hand, was shoot the arse off a fly at 300 yards, which meant that I didn't give a toss my jokes didn't land, as long as shots like that did. Then there was Manu, the French bloke, who said that he'd fought in Malia before hearing about the plight of the Virunga Rangers. And then there was Nick, another American who was a massive animal lover and Tanner's polar opposite in almost every conceivable way. They had their fair share of disagreements, but there was a mutual respect between the two of them, so they worked well as a team. But perhaps the most intriguing of all the blokes on my training team was Yuri. Yuri was an absolute unit of a man, who looked a bit like the bloke Jason Momoa played in Game of Thrones. He claimed he was a mercenary, and sounded very, very Russian, but then when I asked whereabouts in Russia he was from, he almost blew a gasket. He said he wasn't Russian, that he hated Russians, and that he was from a place called Moldova, where hating Russians was a sort of national tradition. And after that I thought that he'd got the hump with me, but it turns out that was basically Yuri's default mood, at least when dealing with humans anyway. And that's because Yuri, despite being built like a brick outhouse, was a vegetarian, and when it came to loving animals, Yuri made Nick look like Colonel Bloody Sanders. And unlike the rest of us, who were only too happy to take the Foundation's money in exchange for our services, Yuri had volunteered in the truest sense of the word, as in, he was working completely free of charge. Thanks to his exceptionally dodgy line of employment, he didn't need the Foundation's money. The only reason he was there was because he loved animals and he despised what the poachers and rebels were doing. Then when I asked him how he reconciled his love of nature with his penchant for killing poachers, he told me something I never forgot. The poachers are like rats, he said. They will kill the elephant and gorilla until none remain. Then what will they do? When they have nothing left to sell and nothing to eat, they will only slaughter each other. Better to send them to hell now, while their bellies are still full. We'd all fought in our fair share of mostly pointless bullcrap wars, most of which were based on lies and greed, of course. So to be somewhere we'd chosen, doing something good for once, it felt like it was good for our souls. But if it was good for our souls, it certainly wasn't easy on our minds or bodies. Patrolling the banks of the Semliki River could be tough going, but then hiking up into the foothills of the Hrenzori Mountains had us absolutely gassed. The wildlife was a huge problem, quite literally when it came to the likes of elephants and hippos, who can become very aggressive when they feel you're getting a little too close to them or they're young. I was probably the most afraid of things like spiders and scorpions, but ironically, while their bites and stings could be incredibly painful, they weren't the things that you had to really keep your eyes peeled for. It was the snakes, like the gaboon viper, which posed the most significant threat to our well-being, mainly because they could be so well camouflaged among fallen leaves that by the time you do see them it's far too late and a routine patrol suddenly becomes a casualty evacuation, because you might just lose your leg, or arm, or whatever it's bitten, unless you get fast treatment. We were told that the bats who roosted up in the trees in the forest were riddled with things like rabies and even Ebola, and that if we got guano anywhere on our bare skin, especially around our mouths and faces, we were to report to the medics immediately because it was a potentially life-threatening level of exposure. We were also told to be on the lookout for bees and wasp nests because, if disturbed, their African variant had been known to pursue interlopers relentlessly before stinging them to death. and we had to worry about aggressive monkeys or baboons, and the crowned eagles that nested up in the mountains could blind you in a dive bomb attack launched from nests that you wandered too close to. We also had to keep away from the freshwater snails who carried parasites that make death feel preferable to going to the toilet. But without a doubt, the thing that scared me the most were the tsetse flies. Tsetse flies are a little bit like horse flies in that they're the size of a housefly but will give you a pretty nasty bite. However, unlike horse flies, who as far as I know can't pass on any disease, tsetse flies can pass on a nasty little parasite which causes something called sleeping sickness. The early signs are things like headaches, high temperatures, and joint pain, and so at first it seems like little more than a stubborn cold. But then later, once the parasite invades the central nervous system, it can cause some horrifying symptoms. I'm talking about things like distinct and frightening personality changes, mobility issues, and a sudden desire to sleep during the day and stay awake during the night. Then, without treatment, the afflicted can grow weaker and weaker until they pass into a coma and die. Seeing as there are no vaccines for the disease, everyone at base camp, Congolese included, were absolutely terrified of tsetse fly bites and the sleeping sickness they caused. But thankfully, preventative measures meant no one came down with it, at least not while I was there anyway. Those were just the natural hazards that we had to worry about, but it was the unnatural ones that posed much more of an active and deadly threat. I remember the first time that we were out on patrol, the first of many snipers' bullets whistled past me. We were walking through fairly long grass at the time, so we were able to hit the deck and wait it out until it was safe to get moving again. Usually speaking, a small group of poachers would see a much larger ranger patrol and take a couple of pot shots at them and then just scarper while we were all in cover. They were terrible shots and probably didn't even zero their weapons properly because who needs accuracy when you're shooting an elephant? But that being said, it never failed to get the blood pumping whenever you heard that crack or whiz depending on how close the shot came. Back when I was in the army, if we took shots from a sniper, we'd have our machine gunners ripping up the horizon, or we'd be calling in airstrikes on positions we even thought might be occupied by said sniper. But then, with the Virunga Rangers, we had to hold our fire as much as possible out of consideration for the wildlife. The poachers shot at whatever the hell they wanted, whereas we had to be absolutely certain about our targets and we couldn't open fire. That was very reminiscent of Afghanistan, so it was something I could adjust to. What I couldn't adjust to was almost being completely outgunned by the enemy. The Rangers' armaments consisted of mostly AK variants, be they Chinese or Eastern Bloc, and then a few shotguns and scoped hunting rifles for close quarters or long-distance engagements. The poachers' rebel allies, on the other hand, were able to field light machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and even light artillery in the form of 82mm mortars. I'd had mortars fired at me in Afghanistan, so again, I knew exactly what to expect. But as it turned out, getting shelled in the Congo was a hell of a lot different than getting shelled in Afghanistan. I remember the first time it happened, we were patrolling the gentler slopes near the base of the Rwenzori Mountains. And this was always risky, as the heavily armed rebel group made the mountains their HQ. But it was a case of either putting on a show of force, or show we weren't afraid of them, or they'd take it as permission to run riot in the park's northern sector and lay waste to the many families of elephants who made it their home. So there were 14 of us walking up and down the slopes, me, Patty, and Tanner, then 11 Virunga Rangers. We hadn't had any trouble patrolling the forest, but then we had to clear quite a large area of mostly open ground to make sure that the poachers hadn't left any traps behind. We'd been plodding through this field of long grass for a few minutes when I suddenly heard what I thought was a light aircraft passing overhead. My eyes darted upwards, but despite the clear blue sky, I couldn't see anything flying in the air above me. But that thought must have lasted no more than half a second, because as I heard the noise take on that telltale descending drone of incoming ordnance, I knew what was coming. I just never heard a mortar shell scream like that as it came hurtling down towards me, and the sound it made was nothing short of petrifying. Afghanistan is a dry place, so when something flies down from the sky at you, it makes a very distinct hissing or whistling sound. But in the Congo, it was so damp that the humidity affected the sound of incoming shells. That dry hissing before something exploded was bad enough in Afghanistan, but the shriek those mortar shells made in the Congo made it feel like the rebels were firing freaking banshees at us. They'd scream this 3-second long sphincter puckering wail that sounded to us like, "We're coming to get you." And that, let me assure you, was somehow far worse than getting next to no warning at all. And then, unlike Afghan, there were trees everywhere for the mortars to smash into, and when they did, the explosion would send a shower of splinters into whoever was unlucky enough to be standing under said trees. I saw some pretty horrific injuries in Afghanistan, but nothing like what I saw in the Congo. All the Rangers wore soft covers, either khaki bush hats or their signature forest green berets. So when mortars or RPGs exploded in the trees above them, they were incredibly vulnerable to the shrapnel and splinters that came tearing down through the canopy. I saw a bloke with a splinter the size of my arm sticking out of his face. It severed his spine so severely that he'd essentially been internally decapitated as it drove its way into his body, the only mercy being that it was quick and relatively a painless death. Another ranger was not so lucky. A rebel RPG gunner scored a direct hit on the tree that he was taking cover behind. The warhead-shaped charge punched through the trunk like it was nothing and cut the ranger in half at the waist. It only managed to drag half of him out of the fight, and he stayed alive and in pain for a shockingly long time. The rest we had to leave for the animals. Nick, the bleeding heart American lad, took a bullet through the shin during a patrol along the river. It punched such a big hole through his leg that we thought that he was going to lose it, and as the massive, definitely not Russian Yuri tied the tourniquet around his leg and threw him over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, he was swearing and shouting, "My mom's going to be so mad at me." It's weird where your mind goes in moments like that. You take a bullet through the leg fighting poachers in Africa, but all you can think about is your old mom back home and what she's going to think about it. Not the months of surgery and rehab or the risk of infection. You think about your mom. But without a doubt, the scariest thing that happened when I was in the Congo happened towards the end of my 6-month stay. We were manning some listening posts out in the forest overnight, maybe 10 to 15 miles away from the mountains. It was something the Rangers had taken to doing in order to intercept the poachers who'd sneak down the mountains during the wee small hours of the morning before preying on animals at dawn. The tactic has proved very effective already, but they wanted to know if there was anything they could improve on in terms of positioning and procedure. So me, Patty, and Yuri ended up going out there with them one night. Nighttime in a war zone is always very frightening, and any little sound scares the shite out of you. Then, factor in that we were in Africa with all kinds of massive creepy crawlies skittering around our wee fighting holes, and it made for some pretty scary moments. But none more frightening than the time we got ambushed whilst in pitch darkness. We were in our fighting holes, all spaced out over 3/4 of a mile, when one of the Rangers started keying his radio handset. A soldier might do this if he suddenly spotted the enemy so close to him that he can't talk, or the enemy might hear him, so as you can imagine, we were expecting a scrap. But when it came, it wasn't the usual chaos we'd grown used to. It was surgical. One Congolese ranger got shot in the chest. Then when we all dived into cover, another ranger leaned out from the tree that he was hiding behind in the hopes of catching sight of a muzzle flash. But no sooner than he did, he took a bullet right between the eyes. That's when I realized whoever was shooting had some sort of night vision capability. They could see us, but we couldn't see them. It must have been like shooting fish in a barrel, to be honest. Rangers who exposed themselves to try and suppress the shooter were almost immediately cut down. Then as we all turned tail and fled, we were doubly exposed. As we ran, more and more of us fell, and for the first time, I was certain that the next bullet had my name on it. They were loud, blood-curdling cracks as bullets passed inches over our heads, and then ear-splitting screams or anguished grunts whenever one found its mark. It was easily the single scariest combat experience I had ever endured, and to this day, I'm not sure how I was able to walk away from it unscathed. Not when so many others didn't. There were about 20 Rangers manning the listening post that night. 20 men who converged on one position with the goal of overwhelming what we assumed was a much smaller force. But it was us that ended up getting overwhelmed. Of the 20 men that went out into the forest that night, only 6 returned, and unfortunately, Yuri wasn't one of them. He wasn't the first foreign volunteer to make the ultimate sacrifice for Virunga and its animals, and I doubt that he'll be the last. But he was the only man to give his life when I was there, so I imagine I'll remember him till the day I die. There were a few more incidents like that, men being inexplicably shot under the cover of darkness, and then one day they just stopped. We went back to owning the night again. The poachers and rebels didn't seem quite so bold anymore, and although that obviously made us all very happy, it left us asking a lot of questions. How had the rebels suddenly got their hands on night vision equipment? And why had they suddenly opted not to use it anymore? They weren't exactly short of cash for the most part, and nor were they professional soldiers, so it was possible they'd bought themselves some expensive thermal imaging equipment only to break it through improper use or lack of maintenance. The theory swirled for a while, and then one day, Top, the coordinator for the foreign volunteers who met me at the airport, said he'd heard a chilling rumor on the SOF grapevine. Apparently, a group of Chinese mercenaries had signed a short-term contract to work somewhere in the Congo. The Chinese have been pretty heavily involved in sub-Saharan Africa for a while now, with their Road and Belt initiative, so it wasn't out of the question that a Chinese-based private military contractor were operating in the region. But when one ex-SOF guy heard that they were headed to North Kivu, exactly where the Virunga National Park is, he figured that was information we needed to know. Unfortunately, we got the news way too late, but as any soldier might tell you, that's something you get used to in a conflict zone. The thing I couldn't get my head around was the fact that we might well have almost been ambushed and killed by Chinese special forces, either former or serving. We'd heard rumors that the poachers had backing from wealthy Chinese smuggling outfits who were heavily invested in the importation of rare animal parts, but for the longest time, we'd considered it just that, a rumor and nothing more. Yet what happened that night at the listening posts, as in the speed and precision with which we were ambushed, had made me a firm believer and makes me think that there's a much more shadowy game being played. After I got home, I read a book about the scramble for Africa, which was the rush by European powers to colonize the continent in the late 19th century. My intention was to learn more about the place I'd almost died in, but all it did was make me consider the present. It seems to me like there's a new scramble for Africa, and the intentions of the countries involved this time are around just as ill as those who took part in the first. Born on September 21st of 1940, Lowell Lee Andrews' hometown newspaper once described him as the nicest boy in Wolcott, Kansas. Founded in the mid-19th century, Wolcott was named for the railroad official who lobbied for an extension of the Missouri Pacific Railroad into the area. This allowed it to become closely linked with nearby Kansas City, and ever since, it's been considered a sleepy attachment to the city's bustling urban sprawl. It's here that young Lowell Andrews grew up, and back in the 50s, Wolcott was still a small, mostly rural portion of Wyandotte County. It was surrounded by farmland and orchards, and despite the construction of a nearby highway, the town was reluctant to urbanize in the same way as other suburbs had. It was a quiet, quaint, and wholesome little town, where young Lowell's intellect and music talents were allowed to flourish. He was a passionate reader, played bassoon in the college band, and by the late fall of 1958, an 18-year-old Lowell had enrolled at a local college to study biology. But despite outward appearances, Lowell did not enjoy his life in Wolcott and was firmly convinced his future lay elsewhere. During late November of 1958, Lowell and his older sister had both returned home to spend Thanksgiving weekend with their parents. 20-year-old Jenny was enrolled at the University of Kansas, where she was studying to become a teacher, and on the evening of Friday, November 28th, she lay on the couch watching TV with her parents after a dinner of leftover turkey. Lowell, on the other hand, chose not to join them, and instead sat upstairs in his bedroom reading the final novel of seminal Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky, entitled The Brothers Karamazov. Set in 19th century Russia, The Brothers Karamazov is a passionate philosophical novel that discusses questions of God, free will, and mortality. It has also been described as a theological drama dealing with problems of faith, doubt, and reason in the context of a modernizing Russia, with a plot that revolves around the subject of patricide. After reaching the novel's conclusion, Lowell is believed to have closed it, placed it down on the desk in front of him, and remained in silent thought for a prolonged period of time. Lowell then walked into the bathroom, lathered up his face, and shaved using his father's safety razor. He did so with precision and care, ensuring that there was no errant whiskers or accidental cuts. Then once completed, Lowell walked back to his bedroom and put on the black two-piece suit his parents had purchased him following his college acceptance. Lowell stopped for a moment to inspect himself in a hallway mirror, ensuring that his hair and attire were nothing short of immaculate. And then, after opening a closet in his bedroom, Lowell retrieved a .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle and began walking downstairs. There in the Andrews family's living room, his parents and older sister had their eyes fixed on the TV. They heard Lowell's footsteps in the doorway but didn't turn to look. Since they were watching a movie, and in order to replicate the magic of the movie theater, the Andrews family had turned out their living room lights. When Lowell flicked them on, they vocally protested, but as his mother, father, and sister turned to look at him, looks of terror filled their eyes. Lowell hadn't turned on the lights to ruin their movie experience. He'd turned them on in order to better aim his rifle. The first of Lowell's bullets punched through the skull of his older sister, killing her instantly. Sprawled out on the couch and in direct view of Lowell as he walked into the living room, she presented the easiest and most obvious target. Lowell's parents, on the other hand, died much, much harder. Lowell put 3 quick bullets into his 50-year-old father, William, and then did the same to his 42-year-old mother, Opal Andrews, as she tried to shield her husband's body. Lowell took a moment to calm himself before beginning the next phase of his plan and approached a living room window before hearing movement coming from behind him. He returned to find that somehow his mother had survived her injuries, and after staggering to her feet, she lunged at him. In little more than a second, Lowell Andrews put 3 more bullets into the woman that had raised him. She fell to the floor, took her final breaths, and then passed away. Lowell stared at her lifeless body for a moment, regarding his murdered mother with a chilling lack of emotion. Seconds later, he heard more movement behind him. Lowell turned, only to see his bleeding father crawling towards the kitchen telephone. He took aim, sending multiple .22 caliber bullets into his father until his ammunition ran dry. He then took out a Ruger .22 caliber pistol from his hip holster and emptied all of its bullets into his father's back. It was a brutally cold-hearted execution, but Lowell wasn't done there. When his pistol quit firing, he ejected the empty clip, loaded a fresh one, then began shooting into his father's lifeless body almost at random. A homicide detective later said that it was as if Lowell had wanted to observe the damage his shots inflicted to different parts of his father's body, a sickening experiment performed on the man who raised him. Lowell fired a total of 6 shots at his mother, but 17 at his father. Then, when all was said and done, he began staging the scene to make it appear as if a household burglary had somehow gone horribly wrong. He opened a window in the family living room, then stacked garden furniture outside it, intent on giving the impression that someone had climbed through the window while the family were dozing. Police were meant to assume that an outnumbered home invader had panicked upon waking the family, and in the ensuing chaos, had murdered them one by one. Lowell then drove over to his apartment in the nearby town of Lawrence, Kansas, where he began to establish his alibi. Having lent a friend his precious typewriter, he arranged to pick it up that evening under the pretense that he had to write an essay. Then, after dropping the typewriter off at his apartment, Lull visited a local movie theater where he attended a showing of the 1958 movie Mardi Gras. He spoke loudly, imparted friendly greetings to other theatergoers, and placed himself in the very rear of the theater so that everyone filing out at its conclusion would see him seated quite prominently at the back of a well-lit theater. Once the movie was over, Lull decided to drive to the banks of the Kansas River, where he dismantled the weapons used to murder his family and tossed the separate parts off the Massachusetts Street Bridge. He then returned to his apartment, telephoned local law enforcement, and informed them that he strongly suspected his parents' house had just been burgled. However, when the police arrived at his apartment and were forced to pass on the bad news of his family's murder, they observed that Lull expressed only the slightest amount of surprise. Yet not only did Lull seem unperturbed at what would normally be considered devastating news, there was barely a hint of emotion about him. When asked how he knew of the potential break-in at his parents' home, Lull began obfuscating. Then once he admitted his 911 call was prompted by what he called a bad feeling, he was promptly arrested as the case's primary suspect. Whilst in police custody, Lull vehemently protested his innocence. He claimed that he had a falling out with his parents prior to Thanksgiving and hadn't been over to their place in weeks. But the fact that Lull seemed to have had a mysterious premonition regarding the incident which led to his parents' and sister's deaths was extremely incriminating. Homicide detectives pressed him for hours, demanding to know why and how Lull had killed his family. It took the intervention of the family's minister, a pastor Vertio C. Dameron, to finally coerce a confession from who he'd once considered a promising young man. Dameron reportedly gave the boy a Coke before asking him, "You didn't do this terrible thing, did you? If you did, now's the time to purge your soul." Lull might have finally admitted to the murder of his mother, father, and sister, but the confession was completely devoid of remorse. Lull told police officers, "I'm not sorry, but I'm not glad I did it either. I just don't know why I did it. I didn't even feel anything as they died." At his trial, the defense argued that Pastor Dameron's testimony of Lull's confession should be stricken from the record. They further explained that Pastor Dameron, quote, occupied the role of minister of the church of which the defendant was a member, essentially claiming the relationship had unspoken confidentiality, similar to that which exists between a doctor and a patient. But as Pastor Dameron himself asserted, there was no course of discipline in the Baptist church by which a member thereof was enjoined to confess his sins to a minister of the church. On the advice of his defense team, Lull pled not guilty to reason of insanity and was subsequently sent for tests at the Menninger Clinic in Topeka, Kansas. It was here that Dr. Joseph Satin established that Andrews was almost certainly schizophrenic, but that he had been completely compos mentis, or of composed mind, at the time that he murdered his family. Dr. Satin went on to call Andrews' crime a sudden murder, meaning his behavior had been perfectly regular both before and after his family's slaughter. This led the doctor to believe the state was well within its right to prosecute Lull to the full extent of the law, in which they promptly did. After taking the stand, Lull's pleas of insanity fell on deaf ears, and following his conviction, he was condemned to be executed. After his request for clemency was denied by the state's governor, Lull was asked about his family's funeral arrangements. "I don't care what you do with them," he said. Then, when asked if he had any regrets regarding the murders, he stated, "I didn't feel anything about it. The time came and I was doing what I had to do. That's all there was to it." After further appeals for clemency were disregarded by the U.S. Supreme Court, Lull Lee Andrews was executed by hanging on November 30th of 1962, aged just 22. His last meal consisted of 2 fried chickens with sides of mashed potatoes, green beans, and pie a la mode, and he gave no last words. Those in attendance gave eerie accounts of Lull's final moments, with one reporter stating he was, and I quote, outwardly remorseless and disinterested. Another reporter, this one from the Associated Press, said Lull was actually smiling slightly as he was led to the gallows. Because Lull was a hefty 6'1" and 250 pounds, it's believed that he had to hang for some time before he was pronounced dead. Other witnesses claimed the rope actually broke, but despite their proliferation, such rumors were never confirmed. Lull Andrews was one of the last people to be executed in the state of Kansas. He was subsequently buried next to his parents and sister in the Mount Salem Cemetery in Excello, Missouri. The three family members were labeled on a single tombstone. Lau's separate tombstone lies parallel and is engraved with a single word: son. Prior to his execution, Lull was detained at the Lansing Correctional Facility, the very same place as the murders of the Clutter family were being held, Richard Hickok and Perry Smith. Hickok and Smith had been made infamous following the release of Truman Capote's book In Cold Blood, with the former being asked what he thought of Lull Andrews following numerous daily interactions with him. He was a funny kid, Hickok said. He had no respect for human life, not even his own. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, in Jesus' name, boom shakalaka. An army brat, and I moved around a lot. Unlike a lot of kids who had this kind of upbringing, I'm gonna break the mold. I loved it. Spend a year or so hanging out with people, make friends who I could keep in touch with, and then move on to something new and exciting. Genuinely wouldn't have changed my child and teenagehood for anything. My new school was no different. I won't name the school or the state or anything like that, even though it was about 2016. Just cautious, I guess. Some of your viewers seem like they're pretty weird folks, not trying to be rude, but I hang out in those live streams sometimes. I'm just kidding. I love all of you. Now anyway, I'm the kind of sad bastard who's into English and writing and aspires to be a journalist or maybe even a novelist. I know, but hey, I have a finished novel. Nowhere close to publishable quality and a work in progress, so at least I'm doing something with my life. But back then, I spent a lot of time writing in the library. Not ashamed to admit that I wrote a bunch of smutty fanfic. Now this isn't relevant to the story, I promise you. You're just not going to have to read about Markiplier having an affair with Justin McElroy, and yes, I did write one about that. The point is, I'd often get engrossed in my dumb smut writing and wouldn't really notice who was around me. And that's why I'm not sure exactly when Andrew started hanging out in the library, sitting a few tables away from me, pretending to read a middle-grade book but clearly watching me. Now let me tell you about Andrew. Andrew was sort of special needs. He was autistic to some degree on the spectrum anyway, and he was kind of mathematical and actually a science whiz. Academically very smart, but he liked reading middle-grade books, and he could not, for the life of him, communicate with his peers very properly. Now, it didn't help that he was hard of hearing, and so he sort of talked with this sort of awkward voice that unfortunately made him sound special. And there were a couple of ASL students at the school, and apparently he could hold the deepest, most intellectual conversations via ASL on the extremely rare time that he could bring himself to engage with someone else. Now, Andrew had taken to watching me. I saw him all over the place. Pretty much everyone I spoke to admitted that This was pretty odd, so don't get me wrong. You'd assume Andrew would be the prime target for bullying, right? Well, wrong. If one of the jocks saw a guy so much as give Andrew a hard time, that guy would regret it. Everyone loved him. He may have been almost incommunicado, but he was sort of like, I don't know, everyone wanted to look out for the kid. And I mean everyone. And so I was careful who I mentioned Andrew's stalking to. I had a handful of friends that I'd made there, and I did bring it up to them. And at first they sort of said, you have to be mistaken. Andrew isn't like that. He's a gentle giant. Now I should mention he was nearly 7 feet tall. I'm not kidding. But then I pointed him out, and the way he'd watch me from corners or just openly, and they couldn't deny it. Andrew was, for want of a better word, stalking me. And the first afternoon he followed me home, I knew that I had to do something. But what? I didn't want to turn people on this otherwise harmless special needs student, and all he was really doing is watching me. It wasn't like with lust. You know how you can just tell when someone's lusting after you? It wasn't like that. It was like he was sort of fascinated with me, or that's what it seemed like at first. Maybe this will seem stupid, but I decided to do a bit of stalking my own. I stalked Andrew stalking me, stalkception, and I watched him watching me, and I kept a note of his behavior. One of my friends helped me too, and we came to an extremely odd conclusion. He wasn't stalking me or watching me. He was making sure that he stayed near me. In some ways, this made me feel a little bit better, but it also made me feel more confused. I could not for the life of me work out what his motive was, and I was beginning to feel more and more alone. And then things started getting creepy. I started spotting movement in my yard late at night. My parents both worked for the military, and while we didn't live on base, they often worked late. And my brother was a little 12-year-old brat who was more of an expert at video games than possibly protecting me, though I love my brother, so he really in that moment wasn't going to be much use. But there was someone clearly lurking out there, and the motion detector light would constantly get triggered. Then I found the scraping on my car that looked like someone had tried to break the lock open late at night. Next, there was a note slipped into my locker. I don't want to recount exactly what it said, but it described what someone wanted to do to me. And let's just say it was more Patrick Bateman than Patrick Swayze. It was written in beautiful, exquisite cursive, and this confused me even more. Andrew might have been a savant at many subjects, but penmanship was not one of them. I'd seen his essay work. The handwriting was like a middle schooler. Surely he hadn't somehow persuaded another person to write this disgusting note to me, and meanwhile, he just kept watching me, and he was always just sort of there. And then one day, he wasn't. And I found out through the grapevine that Andrew had an appointment of some kind of neurological clinic and would be gone for a few days. And of course, in that moment, I felt some relief. Well, the fool I was. That evening, I found another note in my locker, even worse than the first, and it actually had blood smeared on it. That night, I was alone overnight. It was a Friday. Someone was in my yard, and they were making a racket, and I could see this black-clad figure, definitely not Andrew, pulling up plants and weirdly spraying the hose around. Obviously, I called the cops. I even yelled out the window that I called the cops, and the guy didn't leave until almost an hour later when the sound of sirens actually blared off in the distance. Now, I was more confused than ever. There was no doubt that Andrew was stalking me, but then so was someone else. Were they in on it together? It all just seemed so unlikely. And it all came to a head when I was walking home one day. It was sunny, a warm day, so I decided to skip the bus. Who followed behind me, ducking behind walls and hedges? Andrew. Now this wasn't normal, and I was sick of it, and I had to say something, so obviously I turned to confront him. And that's when Andrew charged. Almost 7 feet of muscle barreling towards me from a few hundred feet away, and I was frozen on the spot. And then Andrew veered to the right, and with a scream, he dived into an overgrown hedge on the verge of the park that we were walking past. Out he came, flying with that black-clad figure in his grasp. Andrew slammed this person down and began shaking him back and forward, bouncing his head off the grass, and he was shouting something, but it was hard to tell what in the chaos. I ran forward. I had no idea whose side I was supposed to be on in that moment, and then the black-clad figure's hood fell away, and we made eye contact. He immediately let loose this tirade of disgusting slurs aimed at me, and he seemed under the impression that I duped or hired Andrew into protecting me from him. I had no idea who he was at first, and then one of my friends came running up and yelled, "The janitor?" And the conclusion is absolutely insane. Andrew, and only Andrew, had been observant enough to notice that the janitor was paying unusual attention to me, and from what we could get out of him, he felt a sort of dark aura from it all, and he said that a voice in his head told him to protect me. And so why was that janitor behaving like this to me? So my dad's job in the military is specifically military police. The janitor had been a private about 15 years back, and Dad had been the one responsible for catching him in the middle of assaulting a female officer, and he ensured that he spent time in military jail and was dishonorably discharged. So, when we moved that time, the janitor recognized my dad around town, researched him, discovered he'd had kids, and discovered that I went to the high school that he worked at, and decided to terrorize me. I don't know what kind of voice Andrew heard to protect me. I don't know if I believe in that type of thing, but I do know that I think it saved my life. Maybe he didn't go about it in the best way, but he went about it the only way that he really knew how. And it later turned out that the janitor had even been threatening him, promised to hurt him if he didn't stop watching me, and even that didn't put Andrew off. I did my best to befriend him after that. He wasn't exactly the kind of guy that you could become best of friends with, but I think he knew how grateful I was for what he had done, and I didn't stay at that school for much longer, as Dad's job supposedly called him away, but I think he requested a transfer at that point. I still stay in touch with Andrew via email. We sometimes play chess online, and he kicks my butt every time. We don't really have conversations as such, and it's a weird, strange relationship, really. But he's the guy who saved my life from a pretty dangerous stalker, I think, who, for all I know, would have taken things as far as killing me. So frankly, I'm happy to lose as many chess games to Andrew as he wants. I'm a high school teacher, world history, and I have been for coming up on 25 years now. I sport a buzz cut, I rock a cardigan, and I'm kinda squishy around the middle. And while my wife says it makes me lovable, I make sure that I'm hardly much to look at when it comes to younger people I work with. Now, I don't say the following to brag, though, not at all. If anything, it was a curse, and it was a choice to let myself go. And when I just started out as a teacher in my mid-20s, I was, according to my girlfriend at the time, Hollywood attractive. My wife, who I didn't know at the time, look at old photos of me and say that I look like that Glenn Powell fellow everyone loves these days. Now, I guess I knew I was good looking back in those days. I had flings with more than one of my female coworkers, all single, I'll let you know. And when I wasn't sleeping with a young art teacher or the drama one, I'd prowl the bars for one-night hookups. And you could say that I was a bit of a male slut, I guess. I admit all of this because I want you to know that I want to stress as hard as I can that as soon as I entered the classroom, I became a different person. I wanted to be approachable to the students, sure, but my mentor drummed it into me from day one that I could not become their friend, that I had to inspire them, but I could not take them under my wing, and this was in the very early 2000s too, so imagine how much worse it is now. I knew he wasn't screwing with me. Another teacher at the school I started at had left under a cloud. Supposedly he was having an affair with a male student, and he vehemently denied it. Who knew the truth? But I swore to myself that I would never even wind up in a position where I could be under that suspicion. I liked my women mature enough to hold a conversation with me, to be on my level, and most important, goddamn legal. And the idea of being involved with a student sickens me, and I have nothing but contempt for the men and women who go down that path. If it feels like I'm fixating on it, there's a reason. Obviously, despite my best efforts, I found myself in a situation that became a living hell. I'll call her Billy, although that wasn't her real name. She was a senior, had just turned 18, and she really had everything. Head cheerleader, on track to be the prom queen, and a very solid GPA, and there was no reason for her to want more from academia than she did. Except for some reason, she wanted me. Now, when you're a teacher, at least a good one, you can just tell when a student has a crush on you. It's usually harmless. The odd comment, a little lingering after class, and it's easy to put the kibosh on that. But with Billy, it was different. She had a plan, and it started off with very honest-seeming questions about her world history assignments. She'd hang around after class, something I was pretty strict about when it came to having students alone in the classroom, and at first I thought she didn't realize, but it soon became clear that she was intentionally waiting for the classroom to clear before coming to me with questions. Questions I realized that she did not need to ask, being the smart girl that she was. And very quickly, I had to set some firm boundaries. I spoke to some other members of staff and shared my concerns, and they agreed that I was right to be worried. A couple of them had their own experiences with Billy. Nothing too serious, but enough to make them uncomfortable. At the same time, I didn't want to make myself unavailable to students, and so I came up with a structure where my classroom door had to be open up at all times, and my buddy Chris, the English teacher, would conveniently drop by after Billy's world history class when his AP English class also got out. Billy soon stopped trying to get me alone when it became apparent that Chris was here to stay and we were maybe on to her. Now one day, a new member of the admin staff, who wasn't aware of the whole saga, told me that there was a student outside the teacher's lounge asking about me. Now, cup of coffee in hand, I went to see who it was. It had been a month or so since I'd really heard from Billy, so I was a bit surprised to see her standing there. Now, I was even more surprised at the somewhat revealing outfit that she was wearing. Now, I was certain that that did not meet our dress code, but I didn't want to get into all that with her, so I just asked her what was up. Billy told me she was having some trouble with class, despite her grades very much saying the opposite, and asked if she could book some private tutor sessions with me to raise her grade. Of course, I said no, maybe a little too quickly. I felt a pang of guilt and then tried to soften my words a little. I didn't have the time for private lessons. If I offered them to her, then I'd have to offer them to my entire senior class. It just wasn't possible. I did, however, offer her the number of a private tutor who she could hire for further studies, a septuagenarian lady who'd been my world history teacher and tutored occasionally as part of her retirement. And surprisingly, Billy never called the number. I guess the business card caused Billy to sort of snap because that's when I started finding the typed notes tucked under my windshield. They were typed on those old digital word processors that were popular in the 80s, the follow-up from typewriters, and exactly the kind of technology that a rich family such as Billy's might actually own. Now, this didn't prove anything, of course, but the increasingly weird love letter content did, and I openly ignored them entirely but made sure to file everyone with the principal. And by now, the entire staff was sure that Billy was the culprit, but A, we had no evidence, and B, we didn't want to accuse an innocent girl, and C, Billy's father was somewhat of a pillar of the community, working in construction building of affordable housing, and also something of a large donor to the school. And they were a decent family, honestly, generous, charitable, and beloved. And if there was some way to handle the Billy situation without ruining her reputation, either at school or with her parents, we wanted to take it. It became harder, though, when those love letters started to become threats. What had started as descriptions of things this person wanted to do to me in a very intimate way shifted into a much more sadist method. It got to the point where myself and the principal were a few notes away from actually going to the cops. What if it wasn't Billy after all? What if it was some sick coincidence? Some woman I hadn't called back after what I'd considered an agreed one-night stand, or a husband I hadn't been informed about. And this theory kind of fell by the wayside when I found a pair of crotchless panties tucked into a drawer in my desk. I kept my classroom locked and made sure no students could be in there alone, so how she'd gotten in was a complete mystery. And if it was Billy, she didn't want to make a secret of it. There was a crocheted letter above the lack of crotch, and the first letter of her real name, and while that didn't mean anything, part of me wondered if she somehow knew that she'd gone too far and had to take steps to ensure that I knew that it was her. She knew I wouldn't call the cops on her. Now, handing a pair of crotchless panties over to my middle-aged female principal was one of the most embarrassing moments of my entire life, even if they were in an envelope, but I still had to explain what they were and then stand there as she removed and studied them. She told me that this couldn't escalate, that she was genuinely concerned for me at this point, as I was young and good-looking, and no, the principal was not one of the colleagues that I'd hooked up with, and made me promise that no matter how guilty I might feel, if it came to it, the law needed to get involved. We were nearing the end of the semester, though, and prom and graduation and all of that, and then I'd never have to see her again, and I wondered if maybe these panties were her final hurrah. But how wrong I was. Much like many of the staff, I was a chaperone at the prom. Billy was a shoo-in to be prom queen, along with her prom king boyfriend, Brad, and I kind of hoped that maybe the romantic win up on stage might change things for her, maybe help whatever was going on in her life. And Christ, looking back, I was a dumb 25-year-old and I really did not understand women or anything really, and I don't remember much about the prom. I remember some students getting rowdy and a couple of ejections for drinking on the premises, and weirdly, my biggest memory, save for the incidents, is just how much Billy Idol the DJ played. He was this British guy, and the majority of his repertoire was British music, and I'm not sure how well it landed with the students. But then came the announcement of prom king and queen. Of course, it was Brad and Billy. They took the stage, and Brad gave some gushing speech about how he was with the woman he loved, and he wanted to make her happy for as long as he could, and she'd always be his queen. And then Billy spoke. I'll always remember her opening gambit. She turned to Brad, smacked the crown off his head, and said, "You sicken me." And then she launched into a tirade about how he was a boy playing a man, and how he constantly wanted intimacy, and she said some extremely crude things that did not paint Brad in a good light. And my heart broke for her. But then she turned to me, and told me that I was the one that she was destined to be with, that I was a real man, and we were soulmates, and we were destined to be together. Some absolute joker manning the lights put a spotlight on me, and there was just complete, awkward silence. What could I do? I had no choice but to tell Billy that there was no chance, that she was a child and I was an adult. And I tried to be as kind as possible. I told her that she'd find someone, but it couldn't be me. And I told her that I did not find her attractive, that she was nothing but just some kid to me. I really didn't notice how much it actually broke her. I was staring at my shoes, worried that I couldn't finish my speech if I looked up at her, and I didn't see the tears pouring down her face and all that mascara. But I did hear the slow clapping and then the laughter and erupting from the entire dance hall, all aimed at Billy, the most embarrassing, mortifying moment of her life, and I'd been the cause of it. But I didn't have time to feel guilty. I saw some movement and I saw Billy leaping down off of the stage. I saw her grab the sharp, lengthy knife that was resting near one of the prom cakes, and I saw her charge straight at me, blade raised, prom dress flying behind her, her face blackened by mascara and tears. And I did the only thing I could think to do as someone that was charging at me with a huge carving knife. I used my years of defensive martial arts training to sidestep her and send her sprawling to the ground. Only she didn't hit the ground. She hit a table behind me on which stood another prom sponge cake, and this one was untouched. The knife flew from her hand and Billy slammed straight into that cake, and the table collapsing under her weight. Everyone was silent for a moment, and then the crowd erupted with even more laughter. Billy pulled herself to her feet, her prom dress ruined, cake and punch and food all over her, and she turned to me, and she stared at me, and I braced myself for the most terrifying threat of my life, and all Billy said was, "I'm sorry," and then turned around and left the school gym. Now, long story short, Billy quite obviously needed obvious psychiatric help that she'd hidden the need for. She had managed to graduate and with a high GPA, but college wasn't on the cards for her. Following the prom and her year of obsession, she spent 2 entire years in a rehabilitation institute. I expected her parents to blame me, and instead they thanked me for how I handled the situation and kept me up to date with her progress. After a year, I moved schools to a different state, and they would write me occasionally. Eventually, they let me know that Billy had been released and asked if I would be willing to receive a letter from her, and they told me they understood if the answer was no, but I decided to say yes. It was a single sheet containing a single paragraph, and I still have that letter to this day, and I can type it verbatim. It said, "Thank you. Thank you for not taking advantage of me. I'm sorry I pushed you so far, and I'm better now. I'm going to college in the fall, and I'm going to study world history, and I will make you proud, sir. Billy." I don't know what kind of life she's living now. I hope it's her best life, and I hope she recovered from whatever caused her behavior. But I know one thing. As I near retirement, Billy taught me as many lessons as I've taught all my students over the years. and I still refuse to be alone in a classroom with anyone who isn't a colleague. I don't think Alex Crowley was his real name, but that's what he went by, and that's what we called him. I didn't know him at first, not personally anyway. He was a sophomore when I was a freshman. I was a grungy skater kid in the late 90s, into Real Big Fish and Green Day and Sublime and a bit of Nirvana and Pearl Jam. I know, both. And I felt kind of like a badass poser because I was into Failure, a band most of my friends didn't even know, and even more badass, I was an American fan of Jesus and Mary Chain. I'd found Darklands and Automatic in an indie record store, and I'd fallen in love with both LPs. I was a bit of a musical snob is what I mean, despite being a 90s skater kid who could do a bit of grinding and a few ollies and landed a 180 spin about once, but mostly just made bailing videos with my buddy. We were the skaters, the losers, the punks, and we loved it. And our heroes, our absolute idols in high school, were the trenchcoat goths in the year above us. Their leader was a fellow called Alex Crowley, and he claimed to be a direct descendant of famed occultist, mountaineer, ceremonial magician, and founder of the religion of Thelema, Aleister Crowley. But of course he couldn't prove that because Aleister Crowley had so many illegitimate descendants that if you were one of them, you just knew. I suppose maybe that was true, but I'm pretty sure neither of Alex's parents were secret descendants of Aleister Crowley either, and I'm pretty sure the guy ate poop too, so I'm not sure that I'd brag about being related to him personally. Now, I remember when Alex and his crew first approached us as we were sort of skating around. They just stood there in their trench coats, staring and scowling, and there were 4 of them. Alex, Ashley, Jack, and Felicity, the only girl in the group who I had the biggest, maddest crush on and who drove me absolutely wild in her low-cut corsets and goth makeup. Now, she was actually nice too, unlike the others. Jack in particular was a thug, and I'm pretty sure he liked to hurt animals, but I won't dwell on that too much. Alex and Flick are the key players here that you'll have to remember, as well as me, Frankie, and my twin sister Kimmy, who were part of the skate crew. Now, this is how things would play out for about a week. Our group would just nonchalantly skate around on the steps outside the high school, and Alex's group, who I later found out he nicknamed the Sons of Joseph, would just stand there watching us, kind of sneering. And then one weekend, we were hanging out at the skate park when we saw the Sons of Joseph come stalking in. One of the skaters yelled insults and derogatory terms at them, and they weren't exactly seen as the cool people by the older guys. But Alex and co gave us as good as they got, and we were enamored. I was even more enamored when I saw Flick walk over to us. Was she gonna speak to me? Oh my god. Well, no. Actually, she spoke to Kimmy and told her that she was a whiz on the skateboard. And later that night, I told Kimmy how jealous I was, and she would not let me live it down. However, being a good sister, she told me that Flick had invited her to the mall tomorrow and maybe I could tag along. Hell yes, of course I would. And so Kimmy and I got there, and we didn't tell the other guys, and I was a little disappointed to discover that Alex, Jack, and Ashley were there too. Well, I didn't have to worry about Jack for long. He got into a fight with a security guard and he got thrown out of the mall, and Alex said that he was done with that prick. He was a liability and he didn't understand the ways, and maybe Kimmy and I would like to take Jack's place in the Sons of Joseph. Now, one look from Flick's bright, mascaraed eyes, and I was nodding like some puppy dog. Kimmy was a little bit more sensible and asked what the Sons of Joseph actually meant. I remember Alex tapping his nose and said that was something we'd discover in time. Sure, whatever, Kimmy said. And Alex replied saying that he'd hoped we'd brought money because we'd need whole new wardrobes to join their crew. I'm not ashamed to say that Kimmy and I came from a pretty wealthy family, and Kimmy was trusted with Dad's credit card. Not me, though. He knew that I'd wasted on probably video games, and she was pretty certain that spending the money on clothes would please our parents, so Alex, Ashley, and Flick led us to a hot topic. My outfit was a trench coat, a Misfits t-shirt, and a pair of leather pants that squeaked when I walked. Now, I wasn't so sure about this, but Alex promised me the squeaking would eventually wear off, and I thought about buying some cool boots, but they convinced me that my purple and black skater DCs looked kinda dope with the goth outfit. Kimmy, meanwhile, got dressed out by Flick, and I gotta say, it was extremely disconcerting to see my sister in fishnets, a miniskirt, and a mesh top with her bra visible beneath. In fact, I actually tried to persuade her that our parents really wouldn't approve of that. And she kinda listened and bought a second outfit that was more like a velour dress and made her look like a vampire, and I suppose that was pretty cool. Now, I could tell that Alex had eyes for Kimmy, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that. I wasn't sure how I felt about him at all, now that I'd spent an afternoon with him. He talked and talked and talked, and he talked about his connection to Aleister Crowley and thalamic magic and crap like that. Ashley brought up the Satanic Bible, and Alex laughed. I kid you not, for 5 minutes straight in the food court of KFC before declaring that Anton LaVey was a fraud who wouldn't know true Satanism if it bit him in the ass. I figured now wasn't the best time to tell them that Kimmy and I were Christians, so we just nodded along. I did do some reading about thalamic lore and the Order of Thelema and things like that over the next few months because I'm nothing if not academically curious. It amused me to discover that Alex was basically just making up crap. None of the garbage he spewed was accurate at all, and even though by then I'd already realized that he was a complete charlatan, it was nice to have something to laugh with Kimmy about. Speaking of Kimmy, Alex was constantly, relentlessly trying to get into her pants. Kimmy could hold her own and had obviously no interest in letting Alex take her virginity, but it still made me defensive. He was a creep and a weirdo, and not only that, he was always claiming to hear voices from his true father. He could never decide whether his true father was Aleister Crowley or Satan himself, and in his head I think that they were sort of interchangeable. One of the messages he mysteriously received was that Kimmy should engage in thalamic intimate magic with him, and when she flat out refused, he said that dancing naked for him with sigils drawn on her body would be enough. Kimmy stopped hanging out with him after that. Too exhausting, she said, and she begged me to ditch them too, but at this point, I'd kind of abandoned all my other friends. But to make matters worse, I was deeply, hopelessly head over heels in love with Flick, and it wasn't unrequited either. We were a couple, but we had to keep it a secret from Alex because according to him, the sons of Joseph, male or female, must only lay with him and nobody else. Ashley had ditched the group by this time too and started hanging out with the chess club. We had a new member, and by the name of Norbit, I'm being serious, a nerdy kid whose presence I couldn't even begin to explain. And so the only way for me and Flick to be together was to pretend to tolerate Alex. Any attempt that we made to ditch him resulted in him mysteriously appearing or showing up at my house, which was even worse because I didn't want him anywhere near my sister. Things would have been fine, I think, if Alex hadn't suddenly had an influx of hormones and decided that his true father was sending him messages that we all needed to obey. Suddenly, Norbert's presence made sense. He was a member of the AV club, and Alex's dark father had instructed him to rig a video camera hidden in the vents in the female changing rooms so we could corrupt the fair sex in the name of Satan without them even knowing. Of course, Flick and I were horrified by this, and Kimmy wanted to kill Alex as soon as I told her, but simply talking about something wasn't a crime. We needed proof that he was actually planning on doing it. He gave Norbit a list of times for the recordings. I stole a copy, and surprise, surprise, they were all times when Kimmy would be coming out of the gym or out of the pool, and this creep was basically planning to stalk my sister by filming her naked. I took Norbit to one side and Flick, and I told him in no uncertain terms that if he went ahead with his plan, we would not only ruin him and his entire high school career, but there was a good chance we'd end his life too. This dumb freshman, I was a sophomore at this point, Flick was a junior, fell for it, and I guess took it so seriously that he changed schools within the month. When it became clear to Alex that his plan to film the girls' locker room had failed, he flew into a rage. He slammed me up against the wall of the AV room, which we now had the keys to thanks to Norbert, and told me that this wasn't going to happen, and that I was going to have to be the one to film Kimmy. I'd be able to do it at home easily, and his true father, the Dark Lord, would bestow upon me untold riches. I told him where he could shove his untold riches, and if he came anywhere near us again, he'd wish he'd never been born. Finally, myself, Kimmy, and Flick were free. Flick and I were able to date openly now, and Kimmy didn't have to worry about this creep trying to, well, creep on her. Or so we thought. As one night Kimmy, Flick, and I were hanging out in Kimmy's bedroom playing 3-player GoldenEye deathmatch, and suddenly, a red light kept glaring on the screen. Initially, Kimmy jokingly blamed one of us, saying that we were trying to put her off with a laser pointer. But then the red light quickly disappeared, and we heard some scuffling and banging outside. I ran to the window to see this trench coat figure fleeing into the night. It was obviously Alex. He'd been testing to see if he could film Kimmy himself through her bedroom window. Flick had the dumbest yet funniest idea. Using our brand new color printer, we printed out a huge image of a fat man's ass and taped it on the window, and then we waited for Alex to come back that night, which we knew he would, and we heard him out there. He was hardly subtle. Kimmy yelled that she was going to take a shower, and we gave it 10 minutes, and then we pulled the blinds open, revealing the large printout of that ass. And I guess Alex had been filming because we heard this sort of strangled shriek and then the clattering of something falling to the floor, and saw that a trench-coated figure was running away again. When we went out there, the school's camcorder lay abandoned in the flower bed. We watched through the tape. It turned out he'd filmed Kimmy more than he thought. We were all watching when she snatched the videotape away from us and watched the next few minutes alone, and her face went pale. "Just underwear," she said. "But I feel sick." Kimmy didn't tell us anything else. Neither of us asked either. But a few days later, Alex was found with both of his legs broken, apparently by a baseball bat, and he claimed that he'd been jumped by a gang of black guys. When we asked Kimmy if she had planned to pursue the video any further, she just said no. I don't want to say that my sister kneecapped a goth stalker while in high school, but let's just say, years later, and even though you passed away 6 years ago, I'll always be proud of you, Kimmy. My high school years took place in the mid-2000s. I'm a female, and for most of my high school career, probably until senior year, my entire friend group was made up of girls and one single guy, called Guy, who was probably the gayest fellow you could ever meet. We all had this weird thing where we decided that none of us were going to date during high school, and this completely went out of the way during senior year when, I guess, hormones just became too much, but as far as I know, most of us stuck to it. Sure, we snuck a kiss at a party here and there, and I'm not saying that we were prude little good girls, but we had this pact with each other that we were just going to focus on our studies. And that's why we were so shocked when one of our girlies, perhaps the most straight-laced, accidentally let slip that she had a mother-effing sugar daddy. We grilled our friend Samantha within an inch of her life. What had he bought you? Shoes, clothes, jewelry? She had it all to display. Was she physical with him? Of course, very much so. She was sorry that she'd broken the pact, but Mr. X might be the one, and she didn't want to let that slip through her fingers, not when he was so much older than her. Of course, that was scandalous by itself and led to another round of questioning. How old was he? Mid-40s? Was he married? And Samantha shyly admitted that yes, he was. Married with kids. Did we know this guy? Samantha said no, but her hesitation in her eyes, they said yes. It was a man in his 40s with kids that we knew. Now, we pretended to let it drop. We lied and said we were happy for her. Of course, we were all pretty disgusted that our 16-year-old friend was being taken advantage of by a 45-year-old man who was clearly lying about leaving his wife for her and keeping her sweet by giving her some fairly gaudy stuff. I don't know much about sugar daddies, but honestly, I would have expected a little more from the gifts. She said he took her out to dinner too and stayed in some nice hotels, but still. So we pretended to drop it, and instead, we all secretly spied on Samantha individually. I know it sounds awful, but I'll stand by it. We didn't want our friend being seduced by some dirty old man. And there was one guy whose name kept coming up, Mr. Kurswell, one of the science teachers. Samantha would often meet with him after class, and while we couldn't spy for too long, it was absolutely the only lead we had. So Mr. Kurswell became our target, and there was definitely something off about him. He'd sneak phone calls into hidden corners during lunch break. If he was using his laptop when class started, he'd often slam it closed and make sure that we weren't looking before he opened it again. There was something very off about this guy, and we became more and more convinced that this balding, bespectacled biology teacher was the one boinking our buddy. But the question was, what next? That's when Guy had this bright idea of trying to follow Mr. Kurzweil one weekend. We had no idea where he'd go or when he'd go, but we decided to time it for a Saturday where Samantha had also refrained from hanging out and heavily claimed that she had a hot date with her mystery sugar daddy. If it was Kurzweil, then boom, we were in luck. If not, maybe we'd catch sight of the real culprit. And so we all loaded into Guy's car, and apparently, as subtle as a cop tailing a suspect, we followed Samantha for nearly an hour and found ourselves in the next town over. It was one of those little towns that you kind of look down on. Jokes about the folks there being inbred and the fact that there was a weird smell. A cellophane factory explained that, and just kind of overall crappy. Not exactly the place that you'd expect a hot date with a sugar daddy. Samantha headed into this crappy mall, and we followed at a pretty long distance, and it became clear pretty quickly that she was checking out some stores. There were 4 of us without Samantha, so we decided that it didn't make sense for the entire group to tail her. We'd be spotted in an instant. And she was headed mostly into these girly stores, so despite her penchant for glitter and pink, we figured Guy should hang back. It was decided that I was the most nondescript and unnoticeable. Not sure if that was a compliment, but it worked well enough here. And so I followed Samantha into a bunch of stores, and what I saw shocked me. The gifts her sugar daddy had been bestowing on her, she was shoplifting them. I followed her into 4 stores and watched as she stole costume jewelry, lingerie, a crop top, and all sorts of crap. Not once did she get spotted by security either. I hightailed it out of there. I didn't want to get wrapped up in all of that, and I didn't want to look complicit. And so I met my friends at the agreed point, a sort of hidden area where we weren't in much danger of being spotted by Samantha. I was all ready to hit them with my revelation, but I didn't have a chance. They were the ones who hit me with the gossip. We were right. Our science teacher, Mr. Kurzweil, was here in the same mall as Samantha, and what more proof did we need? I waited until they finished chattering and then told them what I'd observed. There was no sugar daddy offering gifts. Samantha was a kleptomaniac. Presumably she'd traveled to the next town over because the local mall security were getting suspicious in our town. And so everyone was absolutely baffled. They definitely seemed Kurzweil, and he definitely seemed sketchy. And at the same mall as Samantha, too. Could it be possible that they were having a fling, but the gifts were stolen for our benefit to try and justify all of it? Or had we been stalking our friend for literally no reason? It didn't make any sense. Why would Kurzweil be at this mall? Now, it was over an hour outside of town, and our local mall was 1,000 times better. All we could do was head out and plan to head home, but first we decided to stop by the food court to grab some macas. And that's when we saw him. Mr. Kurzweil sat at a goddamn McDonald's 2-seater holding hands with someone who was not his wife. And it wasn't Samantha, though, either. Mr. Kurzweil and the man whose hand he held both turned to us. The unknown man looked puzzled. Mr. Kurzweil looked sick. He stood up and immediately began pleading for us to come over. Now, let's get this straight. If we hadn't suspected Kurzweil of being Samantha's sugar daddy, we would have gone on liking the dude. He was one of our favorite teachers, in fact. And now, he looked close to tears. The idea of him having an affair, even if it was to hide the truth of his identity, kind of made me feel sick, and the first thing I thought was, his poor wife. But then he called it over and explained everything. His wife knew. She too was of the same kind of proclivities as he was. She'd also always wanted kids, which were indeed his, and they both loved their kids very much. And they loved each other too, but in their own little way. But this whole business had begun years ago, before homosexuality was quite so acceptable, and the whole deal that they had with the kids and an unusual marriage, it had been a long-term lie that they just didn't want to have to explain to friends and family. He said that we could call his wife if we wanted. He said that he knew we were good kids, and he said that he was sure that some of us understood, looking pointedly at Guy at this point. And that's how the stalking of our best friend and our science teacher led us to helping him and his wife cover up their conventional marriage. We provided alibis and we did all sorts of things. And we also kind of cut Samantha off after we tried our best to talk her out of being a klepto. She refused and also saw no problem with the sugar daddy lie. We didn't tell her anything about Kurtzwell, but we did tell her that we'd had a suspect and she didn't seem to care about their well-being. It just made us realize that people are never who they seem to be or who you expect them to be. And as a funny aside, Guy, who is the campiest, gayest man I've ever met, eventually realized that he was just as into women as he was into men, and now he's one of the biggest players, in a nice way, that I've ever met. Mr. Kurtzwell still lives with his wife, and their kids have gone off to college now, and they're considering finally living their true lives. The kids know the truth and have done so for many years, but ultimately, it's whatever makes them happy. All I'm glad is that our one little jaunt into stalking didn't lead to the ruination of multiple lives. But I'll tell you what, from now on, I've decided that unless it seems like someone's in danger, nothing is my business to get involved in. It was my idea to put on a horror production. We were the alternative theater kids. We begged the drama teacher to let a bunch of us do our own thing, and instead of yet another performance of West Side Story or Grease, all our bitching worked, and eventually Mrs. J relented. Now, my friend Kirsten wrote the script. It was a slasher play rife with squibs and blood and fake ghosts, and low on plot, really. Nobody was going to attend expecting to see Waiting for Godot, though. They wanted blood, guts, and one shocking scene, boobs. Now don't worry, we used prosthetics. None of us were getting our boobs out for a goddamn school play. Plus, we didn't want to get expelled, obviously. We practiced that play for God knows how many times, and at that stage we knew it off by heart. But something we'd never done is perform it at night. And that's when it would be debuting as a horror play, so, of course, we begged and pleaded with Mrs. J to let us start one final rehearsal at 8 p.m. It took some cajoling, but she relented. The grumpy, scary janitor even agreed to stay late to keep an eye on us so we didn't break his crap. Now, we were all excited. There were 8 of us in total, 6 players, the director, myself, and the lighting and sound guy. I won't list all 8 names because you'll forget them all, but the 4 important ones are me, Ayla, Victor as an actor, Judd as an actor who plays the killer, and Clyde as an actor, the tragic hero. And so we ran through the first scene where a few of the characters are playing spin the bottle in a cabin in the woods. The bottle stops 5 times, creating the shape of a pentagram, and a visual effect causes a mysterious puff of smoke to leave the bottle. Dead impressive. Of course, all the characters decide that it's the ghosts of Rancid Jack, a serial killer who stalked those woods 100 years ago. And of course it is. So the rest of the play continues with the characters getting picked off by Rancid Jack one by one, until only Vicky, the virgin final girl, and Clyde, the boyfriend, are left. After we ran through the first scene, 2 of the actors went outside for a smoke break and they never returned. It didn't matter too much, we just decided to mess around tweaking some of the practical effects. The sound guy did a bunch of improvements too, and I really think we had something special on our hands. To this day, I swear that if we'd actually got to perform this damn play, it would have gone down in our high school history, and not just because of the prosthetic bloody boobs. Now, eventually, we needed our 2 missing actors, so the other actor, Layla, went to look for them. She didn't return either, but we did hear a scream. This caused Judd and Clyde to go running out into the barely lit corridor. Me and Vicky stayed behind like the nervous girls we were, and of course Denny, the sound guy, had to stay and protect us. Now, this was his excuse anyway. Eventually, Clyde and Judd returned, looking pale and terrified. There'd been no sign of any of the missing 3, except for a bucket load of blood. Some of it was outside, and some of it was in the corridor. Now, of course, we all started freaking out. The only person in the building who wasn't accounted for was the freaky janitor, Mr. Williams. All sorts of rumors circulated about this guy. He was an ex-con. He'd spent time inside for killing a man in a bar fight, and he'd fought in Vietnam and had the highest kill count in his unit. He had a tin of Viet Cong teeth in his little basement office. One student swore blind that they'd seen it before Williams had chased him off. Now, there was no doubt in my mind, freaked out by constant horror play rehearsals and the alleged blood, that this janitor had killed our friends. Maybe he'd watched the play and it had triggered the Nam flashbacks. Who knew? Denny and Vicky and Judd volunteered to go get help, which, thinking back now, was kind of an odd group. Why 3 of them? All I knew was that this left me with Clyde, my IRL boyfriend, and I wasn't going to argue against holding up with him. Now, we hid in the sound booth and listened in horror as we heard running footsteps and screams and even pleas for help. All 3 of our friends had met grisly fates, we thought, and that just left us. We had no choice but to try and escape the building and call the cops. Clyde grabbed a heavy metal bar and we made our way into the corridors, and if there had been blood there before, it was gone now. Williams must have cleaned it up, and there was no sign of the bodies either. I was crying, begging Clyde to protect me, begging him not to let me die. And then, up ahead of us, the door to the maintenance area burst open. The janitor stood there, some pole held in his hand, and a look of fury on his face. He yelled, asking what the hell we thought we were doing. Clyde didn't even think to stop. He charged Williams with a metal pipe and cracked him in the skull, and this sent him collapsing to the ground, and then Clyde went to town hammering the guy's legs so he couldn't come after us. And between the grunts, he told me that he didn't want to kill him, that he had to face justice, but he had to make sure the guy never walked again and couldn't come after us. And by the time he was done, Williams' right leg was a bloody pulp, and the left had visible bone fractures in 3 places. Williams was trying to say something. Blood was bubbling out of his mouth, but Clyde kicked him in the side. Then the door burst open, and the rest of the cast yelled, "Surprise!" The cry died on their lips as they saw Williams lying on the floor, Clyde standing over him with a bloody dripping pipe like a madman, and the whole thing had been an idiotic, ill-fated prank. Everyone was in on it except for myself and Clyde, and Mr. Williams apparently. The prank ruined all of our lives. Despite thinking he was protecting his girlfriend from a stalker, Clyde faced charges when Williams, quite understandably, demanded that the full weight of the law come down upon him. And due to the extenuating circumstances, he only spent a couple of years in juvie, but it still ruined his life. The others had to live with the guilt of what they caused. They were all expelled, of course, and more than one of them ended up taking a dark path through life. And from what I know, at least one of them has ended their life over that guilt. As for me, I don't know that I'll ever get over it. Seeing Clyde defend me like that only to mutilate an innocent man, and even then I can't convince myself that there wasn't a serial killer trying to take us all out that night. My head is a mess. I've been in and out of institutes, and my latest therapist recommended that I blog about my teenage drama. I don't know if sending my story into Let's Read is the best, most cathartic idea. I know many of your audience will tell me I'm a terrible person and that we all deserve what we got. Maybe that's what I need to hear. Maybe I need to accept that we all jumped the gun and acted like fucking retards. I know we did. I guess I just need to self-flagellate, and I'm hoping that the Let's Read audience will finally either help me move on or help me blame myself enough to make a final decision. All I want to say is, Mr. Williams, if you happen to hear this from heaven or wherever you are right now, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve any of that, and you weren't a stalker, and I'm sorry my boyfriend crippled you. Hey, Dark Somnium. I'm a YouTuber just like you. Not quite as big, sadly. I've only got a few thousand subscribers since 2012, but I'm getting there. I got some plans for the next year that should bring me into the big time. I'd love to pick your brain for some help in getting bigger, actually, and if you got the time one day, email me at drinkthepiss@gmail.com anytime you want to chat, and would be really appreciated. Now, I'm not just emailing you trying to collaborate, though, I promise. I have a quick, scary story that I want to share with you and your lovely audience. Please subscribe to me on my channel, by the way. And so my channel is, I've kind of hit a brick wall. I hit a few thousand subscribers back in the 2010s when stupid Call of Duty videos and YouTube poops were popular, and I've never really grown since then. People don't care about goofy COD videos anymore, it seems, or baked memes, and it makes me sad. Anyway, that's not the point. The point is, I was a high schooler when I got big on YouTube. As you know, being an old man veteran, a few thousand subs was a big deal back in 2013, before the likes of my heroes like Leafy and iDubbbz, not to mention the main man Charlie and that Hassan Piker the Twitch streamer. And the way I figure it, when you factor in inflation, 3,000 subs in 2013 is about the same as 10 million now, give or take. And so, when some kids at my school discovered that I was a YouTuber with what they saw was a crazy amount of subs, I became something of a celebrity. They uncovered my double life because I made the mistake of watching my own content on the library computers, and they saw what I was up to. Oh well, I thought. I kind of expected that I'd just become a minor celebrity in sixth form, as I went to one of the UK schools that includes sixth form as part of the school itself, and yeah, I guess that happened. Now what I didn't foresee, though, was Rick. Rick was in the year below me, so AS level, and he was a film studies student. When he discovered I was a successful YouTuber, he went kinda nuts. It took him a few days to gather the courage to approach me, but when he did that day in the cafeteria, there was no stopping him. Rick talked. A lot. He had all these ideas for my YouTube channel. Ideas that even I, as a forward-thinking and imaginative individual, could clearly tell were too ambitious. Now, I was out there making COD fail videos, SpongeBob memes, and Counter-Strike parkour videos while talking about the latest online drama. Rick basically wanted us to make a goddamn feature film. I wouldn't have minded so much about Rick sitting at the cafeteria table with me every free period. Nobody else really did, and they were a bit intimidated by me being a big YouTuber, except for the fact that Rick stunk. And now, excuse my language, but he smelled like Jason Momoa's armpit hair. In the end, my nasal cavities couldn't put up with Rick's stink anymore, so I told him that I just wasn't interested in his stupid video ideas. And I could see the tears welling up in this kid's eyes as I told him the home truths he needed to hear, and I thought that'd be the end of it. But no, I kept finding notes in the common room, the cafeteria, and all of my classrooms pinned to the notice board and the whiteboard. Sometimes they'd just say, "Make videos with me, please, Rick." And other times they'd be an entire page describing some idea about an entire zombie movie that he wanted us to film and release on my YouTube channel. And the more I found the notes, the more Rick kept bragging about how his YouTube channel was growing. So in the end, I looked up the channel name that he'd given me, Ricky Dicky Davy, it's thankfully gone now, and saw that the chode had 8 subscribers. Effing heck, mate. I subscribe anyway, out of pity. Big mistake, I think, and this inspired Rick to start posting. A lot. But he didn't just post the usual YTPs or takedowns of Pokemon or Content Cop or elephants pooping at the zoo. No. Every video he posted was a clip of behind the scenes of a famous YouTuber. He didn't say a famous YouTuber. He said my username, but I don't want to do too much self-promotion here. It was crazy. The dude had been filming me all around college, from a distance, eating alone in a cafe, hanging out on the quad smoking a cigarette, playing squash in the gym, coming out of the changing rooms all sweaty. And I kid you not, he filmed me in the changing rooms, not naked thankfully, but titled, "Famous YouTuber Works Hard for His Fans." Now, I could immediately tell this was stalking, pure and simple. Now, I'd had enough of this Rick guy. I found him spying on me one day and took his digital camera and smashed it to pieces on the ground. I slammed him up against a wall and told him that if he ever filmed me ever again, if I ever saw him on my channel again, I would ruin his life with all of the power of a certain Chan-based message board who I had a good relationship with thanks to my videos. I thought Rick got the message. I got an in-school suspension for fighting, but it was worth it. Rick left the school at the end of the term, but not before telling me he'd get even with me. I thought nothing more of the confused little prick for 3 years. He never uploaded again, and I went off to college and continued my career. Things weren't great. I struggled to make friends and then hit rock bottom when my girlfriend left me, and I'd never know what true suffering was like until then. I became a bit of a shut-in for a while, but eventually got over it and became a party animal. Filming it all, of course. And speaking of filming, there was one final twist in the tale. One day, I get an alert on YouTube saying that Ricky Dicky Davy has uploaded, and so I click the video out of morbid curiosity. It's a series of videos, in fact. A series of videos taken on a handheld camera filming a house at night from outside. My house. My shared house at college. Somehow Rick had tracked me down. I watched in horror as he just filmed me through my living room doing my stretches and exercises and playing the PlayStation. And that was all. Just hours and hours of footage of me doing nothing. The video ended with a movie maker text saying, "This is the price of fame." Then Rick walked back towards the camera, showing a steaming turd on my driveway. a turd that I remembered picking up that morning and believing it to belong to the dog next door. Ricky Ticky Davies' channel is now gone. Mine's still up, and again, I'd really appreciate a shout out to the channel if you read the story. But even though I only have a few thousand followers and I've moved twice since the events of this story, I still live in fear that one day, Stinky Rick will find me and make me the subject of his new video, and this time, from an old friend's wife. I thought it'd be her and my old friend Luke passing on some belated Christmas wishes, as I hadn't seen either of them over the festive period. It marked the first time in almost 20 years that I hadn't seen him during that time, but for that, there was a very reasonable explanation. The week before Christmas, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away. He and his family were devastated, so instead of doing the usual and spending every spare moment down at the pub, he very understandably wanted to have a quiet Christmas. The funeral had been small, a family affair, and so when the name of Luke's wife popped up on my phone, I was excited to hear from her and my old friend. But as it turned out, Luke wasn't there, and in fact, he'd gone missing. Sarah said it wasn't so much Luke's absence that worried her. It was what he'd said before he left. He was still grieving, so the idea of him needing some time alone was understandable, but when Sarah said he mentioned something about talking to an angel, my jaw dropped. Sarah asked where he was going and why, and Luke only told her, "You wouldn't understand," or "You wouldn't believe me." Sarah then said she wouldn't let him leave until he told her where he was going, and when Luke replied, "To talk to an angel," she was too stunned to stop him as he shoved his way past her with a bag full of supplies and some spare clothes. When she asked if I knew what that meant, I said yes, that I did, and that while I couldn't promise anything, I had a pretty good idea where I could find him, and not only would I tell her where that was, I'd do one better. I'd drive all the way up to Scotland, and I'd bring Luke home myself. Sarah was worried Luke had gone insane, and while I didn't know if that was the case, I knew that if we got the police involved, Luke might end up getting into some serious trouble. Now, we didn't want him locked in a cell or doing 30 days in a mental health unit if all he needed was just a nice hug. And if he needed serious treatment, then sure, we could go down that road if we needed to. But both me and Sarah agreed that the best thing to do was to find him before he got himself into trouble. And not just the legal kind either, more like trouble from the weather. Sarah noticed how Luke was packing some camping gear into his car before he left. Another thing which frightened her because where was he planning on camping in the middle of bloody winter? She had no idea, but I did. Like I said, Scotland. More than 20 years before, when myself, Luke, and two friends of ours were all either 21 and 22, we went on a camping trip to Ayrshire. We drove out to a place called Loch Braden, set up a campsite near the loch's edge, and then spent a few days roasting chestnuts on an open fire, getting piss drunk and hoping it would snow. And yes, you heard that right. We didn't head out camping in the summertime like normal people. We went 2 days after Christmas because we felt cheated out of a white one and fancied an excuse to booze it up around a warm, crackling fire. Now, I know that probably sounds mental to some people who'd rightly assume winter camping to be a pretty terrible idea, but we were young, dumb, and full of such terrible ideas. And so off we went. It didn't snow while we were there, but we did find a chestnut tree, and now the taste forever reminds me of freezing my balls off up in Scotland. It was worth it for the fire and booze and the banter, though, and it wasn't just beer and vodka keeping our own fires burning, if you know what I mean. We were passing spliffs back and forth, but not Luke. Luke didn't do anything like that, so nothing but alcohol passed his lips. Or at least, it seemed that way, right up until the point he just sort of walked off. Now, me and our two friends were absolutely bombed, so while we were splitting our sides over absolute nonsense, Luke seemed to be on a different wavelength. I kept an eye on him to make sure that he was doing okay, and he didn't seem sad, but over time he got quieter and quieter until eventually he just got up and walked off on his own. We called out to him, asking where he was going, because we'd usually announce if we were going for a piss or whatever, for safety purposes, I suppose. But Luke didn't say anything, and we had to call out and ask where he was going just to be told, "Just going for a walk." Now, me and our two pals started poking fun at him and saying he was slinking off to take the knock, as we called it, which just means vomiting after drinking or smoking too much. Now, I thought that he'd be back in a few minutes, but I think maybe an hour flew by with us just laughing away before we realized that Luke still hadn't come back. And we started panicking a bit, because our mobiles were useless out there in the middle of nowhere, so off we went with our torches to go looking for Luke. Now, it got quite scary at times, and not just because we were so drunk and stoned, but because reality started to become something of an elastic concept at times. That was mostly my fault, and that admission will make a lot more sense later. But for now, let me quickly reassure you by saying that we found Luke, safe and sound, and got him back to the campsite. Now, we were all knackered by then, and so not long after getting back to camp, we got into our sleeping bags and let the campfire burn down as we got some much-needed rest. But then, as we're all lying there in our tents and there's nothing but quiet and stillness, Luke spoke up in this obviously drunken voice and said something like, "Guys, I saw an angel out there." Now, he said it so sincerely that we all just sort of burst out laughing. One of our friends, Ben, replied asking, "Bloody hell, mate, how much you had to drink?" Now, our other friend was laughing, saying, "You saw a Christmas angel, did you? My arse, you did. The angel flew out of those lagers you were drinking." Now, Luke insisted he wasn't mistaken, but sounded like he was on the verge of passing out, and then once the laughter died down, we all just sort of slowly fell asleep. Now, the next day, we packed away the camping gear and agreed on a nice fried breakfast in a cafe before heading home. We poked a bit of fun at Luke over his claim that he'd seen an angel, but he took it on the chin with a very much, "Fine, you don't have to believe me" kind of attitude. Now, I assumed Luke might feel a bit embarrassed and was all too willing to move on from his little sighting, but he didn't. In fact, over the next year or so, the angel sighting seemed to be the basis for Luke's newfound faith. He didn't turn into a complete Bible thumper or anything like that, and since he didn't shove it down our throats or anything, me and his other friends were just kind of like, "Whatever floats your boat, pal." Some came to believe that whenever Luke talked about the angel, he was weaving a kind of metaphor about finding God up in Scotland one Christmas after having a bit too much to drink. But I knew Luke wasn't talking in metaphors. He really did think that he'd seen an angel. And so when he told his wife that he was going to talk to one, I had a pretty good idea of where he was heading. And that place was Loch Braden, the same place that we'd gone camping all those years before. I rang into work, told them I needed a few days off of work for personal reasons, and then drove up to Ayrshire first thing in the morning. I then reached Loch Braden by about 1:30 in the afternoon, and there was snow at the time, not much of it, but enough to give it that proper desolate look. And I can't say it was enjoyable though, because strong winds meant that it was absolutely freezing, and I had to bundle up against the cold before heading out in search of Luke. I didn't wander around the loch calling out his name. Instead, I was laser guided towards the place we'd camped at all those years earlier, and when I found it, there stood a dark green tent with a dead campfire and a few bits of camping equipment sitting near the entrance. I called out to Luke asking, "Are you there, mate?" But the tent was empty. I had no way of knowing if the tent was really his, not until I found the Bible he had sitting next to a rolled-up sleeping bag, and then I knew. I then spent the next hour or so wandering around the snowy woods calling out Luke's name, but when I didn't find him, I wandered back to his camp and decided to wait for him there while I got a fire going to keep warm. It was almost dark by the time I heard footsteps approaching, and at first I was a bit nervous that it wouldn't be Luke. But it was, and since I already had a feeling that he wouldn't be pleased to see me, I wasn't surprised when he wasn't. No, I said something to him like, "Hey mate," and was about to offer an explanation as to why I was there, but Luke cut me off by asking who told me where he was. Now, I didn't want to get his back up by treating him like a kid. I wanted cooperation, so that's what I went with, and told him Sarah was worried about him. He didn't get angry or anything, not yet, because he knew we were just concerned about him, but Luke did let me know, and very firmly, that he wouldn't be leaving till he talked to his angel. I honestly couldn't tell if he had gone crackers or not, so I tried to test him in my own little way on little bits of info. I asked him how long he'd been there, what route he'd taken on the drive up, and what he'd said to Sarah before leaving. All his answers seemed kind of lucid, and he didn't mention any kind of wild conspiracy theories or anything delusional like that, and he didn't go off on any religious rants either. He said he didn't expect me, his wife, or anyone else to understand, but he needed to find his guardian angel because he needed to get a message to his mom. And when he said that last part, it felt almost like a punch to the gut. Or maybe that's the wrong way of describing it, but it was just such a sad but almost sort of relatable thing to want. Like I said earlier, Luke's mom had suddenly passed away, and he was understandably taking that very badly. But it wasn't a question of what he was doing being healthy or not, or if what was happening was something much more damaging. It was a question of what Luke was going to do when I told him the truth. We had a nice long chat about the camp trip that we went on, and then touched on how his mom's funeral had been. It was nice to reminisce, but seeing him grieving so deeply was very tough. But then as we continued talking over a campfire supper and the darkness fully crept in, we got talking about Luke's angel and what it may or may not have been. Again, he was weirdly reasonable about it and didn't expect anyone to understand. It was just something that he had to do so he could be at peace with his mom's passing. But then, I asked how he'd feel if I could guarantee he wouldn't find his angel again, because it was my fault he thought he'd seen one in the first place. Luke just sort of laughed, because the very idea that it was me that was responsible for him seeing his angel was laughable. But the only reason he didn't full-on belly laugh, at least in my opinion, was the look on my face when suggesting it. Because I wasn't joking. In fact, I was very serious. Because the reason Luke wandered off in a daze like he did, and the reason he believed that he saw an angel, was because I put a tiny bit of LSD in his alcohol when he went off for a piss. He was already drunk, and he was drinking some cheap piss, so he didn't pick up on the taste at first, and I thought it'd have a funnier effect on him, but I guess it didn't. And when he didn't come back when he thought he would, I felt very personally responsible. No one but me knew I brought any, and I was planning on telling him that what I'd done come bedtime or the next morning. But after we, or should I say I, almost lost Luke, I decided not to tell anyone what I'd done for fear of the backlash. And then as the years went by, I felt more and more guilty about what I'd done. So much so that when Luke's wife told me that he'd put himself in danger by camping up in Scotland in the middle of winter, I felt personally responsible. It might have only been a snort, but Luke laughed when I suggested I was responsible for his angel sighting. But when I mentioned the acid that I'd slipped into his beer, not even trace of amusement was visible in his face. He went full-on denial mode and argued that I was only saying that to get him to come home. Now, I suppose I should make it clear to anyone reading this that I wasn't just making it up, and I really did put drugs in my friend's drink. My defense at the time was that it wasn't much. Enough to get him loosey-goosey, but not full-on tripping. But that's no excuse, I know that, because that one stupid joke had altered Luke's whole reality. And although he completely refused to accept it at first, that didn't last long. I think the thing that really pushed him over the edge was when I started describing his symptoms back to him. I told him that although he was quiet, I was worried about him because I knew the dose that I'd given him would serve as a real mood enhancer. And I also knew that he'd walked away from the fire at first because it was too bright for him. First-time trips can be like that, especially if you don't know what's going on. And I added it was me who initiated the Luke's going to vomit joke, partly to try and distract from the fact that I'd dosed him. I told him whatever he'd seen out there, be it a trick of the light or a big bird of prey passing over the face of the moon, his imagination had taken hold of it and turned it into something it wasn't. I was halfway into explaining how I knew it couldn't have been some full-on hallucination because I'd given him such a low dosage when Luke just charged me. He didn't shout or scream, he just started attacking me in a complete frenzy, punching and kicking till I was on the ground and curled up in a ball shouting, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I did try and defend myself at first, purely on instinct, I suppose. But as you can imagine, it was a complete mismatch in terms of how angry he was versus how sorry I was. And when he stopped kicking me, Luke dropped to his knees and kind of rolled me over. I thought he was going to start punching me in the face, but instead, his hands went for my throat, and he started to strangle me. I reached up to try and claw his fingers away from my neck, and then I tried grabbing his arms at the elbows to drag them away, but neither thing worked. And it was then that I had this horrible moment of realization that this was how I was going to die. Murdered up in Scotland by one of my oldest friends because I'd revealed his entire belief system was the result of nothing more than a prank. I don't think I deserved to die for something like that, but in the moment, I had a very dark sense of, I get it. I brought this on myself. I still tried to get his hands off of me, but all that rage in him, it was like it gave him super strength or something. And I think it was only the thoughts of the consequences that made him stop. And by that I mean if he thought he could have gotten away with killing me, I'm not sure Luke would have let go. But he did. And when he did, it was like taking my very first breath of life all over again. I've never known a lungful like that, but I could feel how puffy and hot my face was from how red it had turned. And all the I'm sorry's got replaced with thank yous, because it was clear he'd just spared my life. But Luke wasn't ready to let bygones be bygones, and after pacing back and forth for a minute straight, still in a rage, he told me to do one, meaning get lost. I remember wanting to ask him if he was sure we couldn't just talk it out, but I knew that'd be a waste of breath. I'd never seen him that angry before, and not that I deserved it, but I knew that there'd be no reasoning with him at this point. Luke saw me hesitating to leave and then came at me shouting to F off and making out like he was going to hit me. And so I did as he asked and left. I walked back to my car, feeling the aches from Luke's punches and kicks and the soreness in my throat, and then drove back home, and we never spoke since. I called his wife from a service station and filled her in on everything that had happened. I put off telling her about the spiking incident for as long as I could, but when I did, she did a kind of verbal double take in asking me to repeat myself, and when I did, she immediately hung up. There was no anger, no insults. She just hung up the phone, and that was the last time I spoke to her, too. I understand why they've chosen to cut me off. I just hope that one day they find it in their hearts to forgive me, and if Luke still has his faith after I told him, then I hope that'll one day be the case. Because after thinking about it for quite a while, and I think that in a way, Luke really did find his angel out there at that old Ayrshire campsite, and when it spoke to him and told him to spare my life, he listened. My name's Allison. I'm from Seattle, and while it took me way longer than I wanted to, I'm finally ready to send this over. For the longest time, I had a friend named Chris, and Chris suffered from persistent depressive disorder. It started after he lost his job, got violently mugged, and then got really sick with some kind of viral infection, all while his relationship with his fiancée was falling apart around him. He ended up moving back in with his parents up near Richmond Beach for a while, and then after finding it harder and harder to get out of bed and leave the house every day, Chris just sort of stopped trying. He was put on various cocktails of medication in the hopes one might work, but nothing did, and for a while he just rotted away indoors. But then in early spring of 2019, Chris asked if I wanted to go get sushi. He was online a lot, which was pretty much the only way we kept in touch, so hearing from him wasn't a shock. But hearing that he wanted to meet in person, that came as a real surprise. I accepted the invitation, and while he still had a whiff of hermit about him, he seemed way, way better than before. I didn't question it. I was just too happy to see progress. But at the same time, I knew that there had to be something going on in Chris's life to prompt such an improvement in him. I'd be damned if I wasn't going to figure out what it was. The day after we met for sushi, I asked Chris what had changed, like if he'd been doing or taking something new. And he said he'd found a kind of support group that met once a week, and since he started going, he'd been feeling a lot better about life. They met in a coffee shop, but they didn't sit in a circle, doing land acknowledgements and using therapy language. It was more like show up, hang out, and just talk to people for real. And that was usually a little talk at the end by the group's organizer, but that consisted of nothing more than a poem and maybe the odd announcement. It was very informal, very laid back, and for the first time in a long time, Chris found the confidence to start living his life again. Now, this was obviously great to hear, so I asked about it, and Chris said the group was called Mother's Love. It seems so crazy to me that after all the medication and all the therapy that Chris really just needed some connection, you know? I don't take it to heart that we as friends couldn't do that for him either, because Chris needed new connections with new people as concrete evidence that he could place faith in his fellow humans again. Sometimes I'd ask him about the group, and that's how I found out that they didn't have any kind of online presence, because they didn't want a whole bunch of people turning up and killing the vibe. It was supposed to be intimate and meaningful, so it was down to attendees to exercise discretion in who they invited. I had to wait months until late December of that same year, 2019, to get anything resembling an invite. But when that invite came, it was not in the form I expected it to be. When Chris asked if I was still interested in getting involved, I told him I didn't know about involved, but I sure did want to stop by so I could check it out. And that's when he told me about the winter retreat. According to him, Mother's Love had reached a point where expansion was starting to make sense, so each current member had been instructed to pick out a +1 for a weekend of camping. And then to incentivize their attendance, the whole weekend of the retreat would be entirely free for that +1. And at first I wasn't sure, because spending 2 nights in a tent together in the freezing cold did not sound like my idea of fun. But when Chris told me it'd be more like glamping, as in like super warm tents with super fancy features, I totally had to reconsider. He said the food would be all vegan, which was awesome, and that the open bar on Saturday night would be a really fun way of making new friends while getting lit for free. Well, that about sealed it for me, and I promptly prepared myself for a weekend of winter camping. We arrived at what amounted to a luxury campground on Friday afternoon, and it was totally amazing. They had showers, a bar that served hot food, and then a kind of conference and party room. And the tents? They were more like miniature cabins. They had covered floors, a heater, separate sleeping compartments, thank God to be honest, and a little communal space with squishy log pillows to sit on. We didn't just have super cozy, faux fur-lined sleeping bags either. We were giving these heavy, memory foam sleeping mattresses as well, and they were super squishy and soft. It was definitely not what sprang to mind when I thought free camping weekend, but I also remember wondering, like, who the hell put all the money up for this? And I definitely wasn't about to question it though, so I just sort of went with it. Now, once we were all settled in, one of the retreat's organizers stopped by mine and Chris's tent and asked us to attend a little conference hall for the welcoming ceremony. We found about 30 people in the conference hall before Chris started introducing me to some of the people he knew. We chatted for a while, making introductions, and finally, an older lady took to the podium and asked for our attention. She introduced herself as Mary, and then after welcoming all the newcomers to Mother's Love, she touched on some topics that we'd be discussing over the next 48 hours or so. And only then did I realize that Chris hadn't told me the whole story. I don't want to rehash everything that Mary lady said, because she talked for like 45 minutes, but most of it was about the seminars, and this is the gist of it. There was one about maintaining a low impact on the environment, which was all well and good, but then there was one about anti-natalism, which turned out to be a fancy word for thinking having babies is like wrong or something. And when I asked Chris about that afterwards, he said some people believe the earth is so overpopulated that it's messing up the environment. But I thought Chris's group was just coffee and pancakes, not hardcore political stuff. And Chris said it didn't start out that way. It was just something that they all got talking about over time. But there seemed to be a dramatic difference between the seminar on centering oneself in nature and the one I think was titled The Death March of Western Capitalism. Now, I thought we were going to be drinking cocoa around a campfire and going on nature walks, but Chris just kind of shrugged it off. He said he wasn't really into the political stuff either, so we could just sit it out if I wanted to and head off on that nature walk when I was excited to. And then I asked him about something Mary had said when she was introducing herself, and his response wasn't nearly so reassuring. And so when Mary, the organizer lady, introduced herself, she said a number in the 300s, and then ppm, and I'm thinking, huh? What? In my head, but she just breezed right past it without explaining. Chris said that Mary and a lot of the regulars didn't use numbers to describe their birth years, They used ppm, which after double checking it, definitely stands for parts per million, and then the number describes how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere during that year. And so like when Mary said, I was born in 300 whatever ppm, she meant like the 50s or something. And I remember thinking, bro, what the heck, this is goofy as hell. Because, yeah, screw the oil companies, dude, sure, but using ppm instead of just saying your birth year, just a bunch of weirdos. But Chris didn't think it was all that funny. I mean, he smiled, but he didn't seem to think it was dumb like I did. And then I asked him if he knew what ppm he was born at. Then, without skipping a beat, he then says 352. He laughed at my reaction and said he didn't go around telling people like Mary and the others. It was just something he Googled one time out of interest and then happened to remember. And I remember feeling like I'd kind of let him down because I was definitely not going to be able to sit through a whole bunch of political seminars. But he said not to worry, that we'd just go to the ones that sounded interesting to me. And then we went over to dinner and got talking about some of the other campers. And that part was actually super fun. Like, I'm a really social butterfly, so getting to meet everyone was cool. Dinner was great too, and we had vegan Indian food and a few drinks, and then after more of that political talk from Mary, we all went back to our tents to enjoy our early night before an early start. Now, I won't bore you with everything we did that next day because it was a lot, but it was actually super chill until dinner that evening when we started to get hyped about the party with all the free booze. But before we went off to our tents again to get ready, Mary had an announcement to make. She said the next morning all the retreat's male attendees would be entitled to receive a gift, a blessing of Mother Nature in fact, and it was entirely free. Unfortunately, the same gift would not be bestowed on female attendees, but that was something that they were looking into, and anyone interested should approach an organizer with their queries. There was a lot of confused female faces, but also notice how not all the girls there looked confused. Some of them looked like they knew exactly why, and that should have been my first big clue right there. Well, heading back to the glamping tent to get ready for the party, I asked Chris what this free gift was all about. Chris said that he had to talk to me about something, but I asked if it could wait because by that point my curiosity was burning. But then Chris said it was that very same free gift he wanted to talk to me about, and so I'm thinking, okay, go on, and when he told me, I remember my jaw dropping. Because Chris told me that free gift was a vasectomy. Now, I thought he was joking, and while Chris was smiling, it wasn't in a jokey way, more like in a this is good news kind of way. As it turns out, I had no idea this was the case till Chris went through it with me, but a vasectomy is actually a super simple procedure. Guys only need a local anesthetic, and then a trained professional can render a dude infertile with just a single needle-thin puncture to a guy's taint. It's not a major surgery, and while a guy definitely needs to rest up and avoid serious exercise or exertion, it's not like he's going to be held up in a hospital bed for a week like a woman after her hysterectomy. And so after I told Chris, no way, dude, they can't do surgeries out here, that's impossible, he made it clear that not only was it very possible, but he was planning on getting the snip, as he called it, that very next morning. And I'm like, this is a joke, right? But Chris wasn't kidding. He said what brought him so much hope was the idea no one else would have to suffer like he did. His parents had brought him into the world against his will, without ever considering whether he might be happy or not. And that was a mistake he wasn't going to repeat. Knowing he wouldn't be able to reproduce made him feel like he was doing something to solve the problem, even if it was just one small but significant act. Now, I'm sure a lot of heartless psychos are going to read this and say, Chris was making a choice about his body, how dare you try and prevent that? Well, first off, go jump in a dumpster. And while you're in there, lying among the trash where you belong, consider that I wasn't objecting to him getting a piercing or getting frosted tips or whatever. I was objecting to him getting a mother-freaking vasectomy. Oh, but what's that I hear you cry? Oh, people from the trash, you can reverse a vasectomy. That is indeed true, but then riddle me this, dumpster dude. Does the reversal involve actual knock-you-out surgery and reopening the old vasectomy scar? Well, yes, it does. And is the surgery always successful? No, it's not. And while I didn't know that till I Googled it in a panic, I sure as heck showed it to Chris when I did. And if he didn't want to have kids, he could put a damned hood on it, or the
100 other not safe for work things people do to make sure their humps don't mean bumps, as they say. But no, Chris had made his mind up. He wanted his little sacred rights so he could respect his mother's love, and there was nothing I could do to convince him otherwise. But on that, he was wrong. Rather than go into the whole drama of what happened when we were drunk, I'll just cut to the important part. We got plastered on all that free alcohol, and while I tried my very best to drop the whole vasectomy objection and just enjoy our time together, that obviously proved impossible. I got fixated on the idea the root of his motivation was destructive, not constructive, and that maybe he wasn't as mentally well as he thought he was. When we went somewhere quiet to talk, I told him how he had zero clue what was going to happen in the future, and how he might well live to regret his decision, especially if reversing the process failed and he was made infertile for good. Now he's drunk and says, "What's the point? What woman would ever want to have kids with me?" And so I told him lots of women would, maybe even myself, because, like I said, you never know how the future's going to unfold. Now, we didn't immediately start making out like in the movie or anything, but I thought I actually got through to him after saying how once he was done putting himself together and had a job and took care of himself, then he was attracted enough that plenty of girls would want to date him. And after that, we hugged it out, and he thanked me for not just being his plus one, but being a good friend and giving him hope. Now, I'll admit, that made me tear up and cry a little, but I was also super smashed, so there was that. We went back to the party, had a couple of more drinks to lift our spirits again, and then we went back to our tent and went to sleep, in our own separate sleeping compartments. Now, my memory of those last couple of hours is kind of hazy, I'll be honest, but what I do remember is going to sleep with the knowledge that one of my best friends was not about to do something potentially irreversible. But when I woke up the next morning, Chris wasn't in the tent. I put on a bunch of warm clothes and went looking for him, but was so hungover that I only got a few steps out of our glamping tent before I ran into a tree and started puking while leaning against it. Now after that, and once I sort of cleaned myself up, I went looking for Chris, but found the atmosphere in the camp to be way different than before. During the previous 2 days, whenever we went anywhere, everyone was saying, "Hey, how's it going?" to us, and were generally super friendly. But when I walked around the camp that morning, everyone just sort of stared at me in total silence. I mean, they whispered and talked among themselves as I passed, but they wouldn't say anything to me, and they wouldn't return my fake, panicking but pretending to be friendly smiles. Now, I kept asking, "Has anyone seen Chris?" But no one would answer me, and it took until I found one of the organizers before I got any kind of explanation. The conference room was being used as the surgery, and I could already see a couple of guys sitting in the little waiting area through a large window, but I couldn't see Chris. And that's when I was approached by that same girl who welcomed us on the first day and was asked to return to our tent so we could talk in private. On the way, I kept asking, "Did Chris get a vasectomy?" But she wouldn't tell me, not until we got back to our tent when she confirmed it. Chris has gotten up that morning bright and early, and not only did he get the snip, but he was literally the first guy to get it done. He was actually resting in another tent as we spoke and was kept separate from me because of what a, quote, negative person I was being. Now, she was the first one who told me what a terrible person I was for not just being like, "Yeah, cool, no big deal, bud." And I said the same thing to her as I'd said to anyone else. "Go F yourself with a cactus, you psychos." Chris was a vulnerable, emotionally damaged person who needed serious psychiatric care, and then as his new friends, instead of encouraging him to get it, they tricked him into a physical solution to what was a mental problem. And personally, I'll never stop hating them for that. I'll also never stop hating them for how they let people treat me as I was leaving. I cannot overstate how sickening it was to attend a seminar on feminism in Trump's America one day, and then the next, have women just standing back and smiling as grown-ass men got up in my face and screamed the C word at me so furiously that I remember their spittle landing on my cheek. I actually thought that they were going to beat me up by the time they started shoving me and throwing rocks. They didn't give a crap that I was Chris's ride either. They said that they'd find a real friend to drive him home, and I should get the hell out of there while I still could. I was shaking by the time I got to my car with my stuff, and I was in tears by the time I had the keys in the ignition. I felt like I'd enabled one of my oldest friends to do something awful to himself, and then by the time I realized what was even happening, it was too late, and I'd done too little to stop it. Chris and I haven't spoken since. I've tried to reach out, but he doesn't want to now. I don't even care if he got a vasectomy anymore. I mean, it's his body, his choice, right? But I just wish he'd stop punishing me for trying to play the devil's advocate and convince him that a permanent solution to a temporary problem might not have been the way to go, and that weird cult that he joined is very, very weird. So Chris, if you're out there, call me. I miss you. My name is Alf. I'm a fan from Sweden, and today I would like to tell you my very own true scary story about the most frightening experience of my whole life. I joined the army when I was 18, and I loved being a soldier. But when I was 23, I was diagnosed with a rare medical disorder and had to be discharged. I was devastated, and while I eventually adjusted to a new routine, I still miss being in the field very much. I ended up asking a couple of my old school friends if they'd like to go camping sometime, and while most thought that that was a great idea, they didn't so much enjoy the specifics of my idea. For obvious reasons, most camping here takes place in the summertime, but I didn't want to go in the summertime. I wanted to go in the freezing Swedish winter. Most people thought that I was crazy, and were saying, "No thanks, friend, I'm out." Others said that they'd consider it and then dropped out one by one as the days ticked down to D-Day. In the end, the only person left who was dead set on joining me was an old friend of ours who'd moved to a different city, a friend named Varg. Varg wasn't really named Varg, it was his nickname he gave himself, meaning wolf, which should give you an instant idea of what he was like as a person. And well, despite it, I can safely tell you that he was even worse than you might imagine. If we hadn't been such close friends for so long, there's no way that I'd have tolerated behavior like Varg's. And honestly, I think him moving to Bergen for a girl that he met online actually saved our friendship, and he wasn't around to act like a jackwad anymore. He would drink and drive, get into big fights with his girlfriend, and post all about it on Facebook, and he was constantly getting fired from menial jobs for doing the stupidest things, like drinking openly on the job or sleeping on shift and then getting angry when his colleagues woke him up. And like I said, I definitely wouldn't have been friends with him had I met him yesterday, but for the most part, we actually got along quite well. We had a similar sense of humor, we both enjoyed the same sort of movies and music, and we both had a big passion for outdoor survival scenarios, and that's how I ended up thinking that just me and Varg, a winter camping trip, might actually be a good time. But one of the real pros of camping in the winter was the lack of bears, which usually hibernate between late autumn and the very late spring. Now, I still insisted that we hang some bear bait somewhere away from the camp, but it didn't help, and even though we went camping in late February, we were unfortunate enough to be found by a bear who'd woken up too early and was desperate to find food. We woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of a huge brown bear sniffing around our camp, having eaten the bait and went looking for more. We rushed out of the tent, yelling and screaming at it in the darkness to scare it away. It appeared to work at first, and the bear backed off, but then it sort of false charged and tricked me into stumbling backwards so awkwardly I actually sprained my ankle pretty badly. Thankfully, it was just a false charge, otherwise I'd have been in very serious trouble. But even though we managed to scare it off for good using the bear mace that we carried with us, we were almost out of food and my ankle was in a very sorry state. I took some painkillers and then we tried to fix up our campsite a little and salvage our food before heading back to our tent. We slept until dawn, not very well I should add, and then once it was light, Varg volunteered to find a shop somewhere so he could bring back food and some stronger painkillers. I thought that was very cool of him, like just the sort of behavior that kept me friends with him, and Varg can be a pain in the ass sometimes, but you could really rely on him when you really needed to. I stayed in the tent with my ankle raised and the bear mace at the ready, and then maybe 2.5 hours later, Varg reappeared with his pack full of stuff. Now, I thought that he'd have more than some bread, bacon, and my painkillers, but when he emptied the bag inside our tent, he had all kinds of stuff with him. He had a few bottles of vodka, a whole carton of cigarettes, dozens of bars of chocolate, and a lot of elk jerky, or what we call renja snacks. Varg also had a ton of medication with him too, but not just painkillers. There were all kinds of things, from anti-allergy medicine to antacids for stomach trouble, and while I expected Varg to be pleased with himself at having brought back such a bounty, he seemed almost angry. He emptied out the bag with some force, like he was full of spite, and when I saw that strange variety of medicine tumble out onto the ground, I started to get kind of suspicious. I asked Varg where he'd gotten all that stuff, and he just said, "I found the shop." But then when I asked him why he bought me anti-allergy medication, he snapped a little and said he just grabbed whatever he could because he needed to be fast. It made sense in a way. Varg wasn't a rich man, and he wasn't generous or careless with his money, and so after a moment of thought, I turned to him and asked, "Did you steal these things?" No, I knew the answer before he even said anything. He had that guilty look about him that I knew all too well, and in the past I sometimes found it funny, because you could always read his face when he'd be the one to do something wrong, like hide the teacher's chalk or put a pin on another people's chair. But that time, I didn't find it funny, and neither did Varg. He still had that angry air about him as he told me, "I didn't have enough money." And I found this outrageous, as any normal person would only buy what they could afford. But at any objection, Varg tried to defend himself by explaining what had happened. He said at first, all he did was put down the painkillers, the vodka, and the cigarettes, but he was short by just a couple of krona, our dollars here. And the lady tells him he needs more money, but Varg insisted it was an emergency and she needed to accept the amount he had. Obviously, the lady saw no emergency, just a man trying to buy vodka at like 8 in the morning, and so she told him no. Varg said he offered to come back later with the rest of the money, but sensing he probably wouldn't, the woman said no once again. And this is when Varg lost his mind. He attacked the lady, beat her till she wasn't moving anymore, and then filled his pack with anything he could grab before running out of the shop. He didn't even get help from me, he just ran before someone came along to see what he'd done. I was furious, but so was he, and if you can believe it, we argued back and forth about who was in the right. Varg insisted he did the right thing for me and him, and that was all that mattered. And to this day, I still can't believe he saw things that way. And don't get me wrong, I appreciate his instinct to take care of an injured friend, but what he did to that woman was unforgivable. And we argued about it for quite a while until finally he announced that he was getting drunk. Varg couldn't go back to the little country shop that he'd found, the only one for miles around. He'd have to walk for miles and miles to some other place to get help. And the cold had completely killed our little flip phones, so we needed a landline, and then since we were way out in the middle of nowhere, Varg would have to search long and hard to find one he could use. So before that, he was going to get drunk. Now, if you imagine Varg planned on getting drunk and then getting back behind the wheel of my car, then yes, that's exactly what he's planning on doing, and this sparked another argument between us. But since it truly was a case of beggars not being able to be choosers, I had to shut my mouth, drink a little vodka to help the painkillers along, and wait until he was good and ready to help me. And there came a point when there was nothing but silence. I didn't have anything to say to him, and he didn't have anything to say to me. And then as we sat there, me eating and him smoking, I noticed a little plane flying in the sky above our heads. I didn't think much of it at first. Who would? It was just a small plane, but then minutes later, I saw it fly over us again before it started circling us. Now, for the sake of nothing but my own amusement, I started waving at it with both arms as if to say, "SOS, help us." I hoped it might fly straight and dip its wings or something, like a sign that it had seen us, but not a minute later, it flew away again without any kind of signal or indication. Varg kept on drinking and smoking for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, then finally stood up on very wobbly legs and said, "Okay, time to go." I remember groaning, not in pain, but at the thought of him being pulled over, or worse, driving my car off the road and getting himself hurt. But as I looked up at him, I saw someone behind him walking towards us through the snowy trees, and he had what looked like a shotgun in his hands. Varg must have seen my expression because he turned around to check out what I was seeing, and then when he did, he yelled, "Run!" and then started sprinting away as fast as he could. I saw the man stop and aim at us, so I tried my best to also run as I heard a single shot boom around the landscape. As per my army training, I instinctively threw myself to the ground, and then I remembered letting out a scream of pain as I felt it shoot through my ankle. I got up and tried to run again, but fell down again. I then tried crawling, but knew that I wasn't moving fast enough, and so I did the only thing I could think of and rolled onto my back to face the man approaching us and begged for my life. I knew who it was, or at least I knew why he was shooting at us. It had to be the husband or brother or son of the woman Varg had hurt, and I was right. It was her husband. He had the shotgun pointed right at me as I explained it wasn't me, that it was my friend and that I had nothing to do with it. I think the man knew this and recognized the fleeing Varg from the description he'd been given because he loaded his shotgun and fired a second time. He missed Varg completely, but I didn't know this at the time. And so in my mind, and because there was no screaming, Varg was stone dead, and I was next. I begged him over and over not to shoot me as he loaded a third shell into his shotgun, and then for just a moment, he pointed the barrel right at my face. I thought it was all over for me. I thought I was a dead man. But after I started to pray, something I hadn't done since I was a child, the man lowered the gun and then offered me a hand to help me to my feet. All I could say was, thank you, again and again. It was no platitude either, but rather it stemmed from the deepest sense of gratitude I've ever felt. The man then told me his name was Oscar, and that if I wanted to leave those woods alive, I was going to help the police find the man who had beaten his wife half to death. I told him that sounded like a good deal, and then he helped me back to his 4x4, and we drove over to his store to meet his wife, who was being treated by paramedics, and more importantly, the policeman waiting for me. I was only too happy to talk to them, partly to clear my name and partly to fulfill my promise to Oscar. I wanted to do the right thing, but I also firmly believed that if I didn't, he would find me and kill me. Varg ended up going to prison for 6 years for what he did, but I heard they let him out in 4. We haven't spoken since, and to be honest, I consider it good riddance. But there is a part of me that wonders if someday he may pay me a visit to ask why I was so willing to talk to the police about him. And without pointing too fine a point on it, if he does, he won't get to escape like he did from that woman's husband.